on via Zoom due to all of our interesting life changes around COVID. And so be aware that the meeting is being recorded. And for purposes of the record, I'll go ahead and take the roll. Please answer verbally. Obviously, don't just nod your head or raise your hand. I am not good at keeping track of raised hands. So Kelly Cassidy.
Here, sorry, stuck on mute.
Ryan Spain.
Good morning, I am here.
Good to see you, Representative. Robert Peters.
Good morning.
Darren Bailey.
And good morning, I'm here.
Ari Jones.
Good morning.
Scott Main.
Morning, everyone.
Sharon Mitchell.
Good morning.
Latoya Hughes.
Good morning.
Joby Cates.
Hello.
Mitchell Davis.
Here.
Shobha Mahadev.
Morning, everybody.
All right. And Bob Berlin, did you join me? And I didn't see you. Well, we will hope that he signs on very soon. Well, welcome to the first meeting of the Resentencing Task Force. So that we are all clear on what the Zoom rules are, John Specker of SPAC is going to review those really quickly for us. John, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first Resentencing Task Force meeting. So the rules of the road are basically everyone will be muted unless they are speaking. So please have yourself on mute. If you would like to make a comment, please utilize the raise hand function that can be found in the participant window. Or you may type a question in the chat window. If you are passed over for your comment, please contact Ryan Kennedy via the chat window or email mark.powers@illinois.gov. We will have a chat queue or a comment queue in the chat feature. So if you pull up the chat feature, you'll be able to see where you are in the comment queue. Please activate your video when you are talking. Please activate your video when you are talking, just so everyone can see who is speaking. If there are any call-in participants, please you can either unmute yourself or you can email mark.powers@illinois.gov again for your comment. Please keep your comments to 5 or so minutes, as we would like to give everyone a chance to speak. If you have any questions or anything like that about technology or any technical issues, I am the person to contact. So please email john.specker@illinois.gov and we will work out how to fix any of those issues. Are there any questions on the rules of the road? Awesome.
All right. Excellent. Well, we do have quorum, so I'm going to hand over the meeting. Well, actually, before I hand the meeting over to Susan Lloyd, I just want to take a minute to let you know that we do have a planning team for these meetings, and it consists of the SPAC researchers and myself, Susan Lloyd and Lisa Fabes, who are our facilitators for this process. William Nissen, who is a retired attorney from Sidley and Austin and kindly volunteered his time and legal expertise, and Lindsay Hammond is the point person for Restore Justice, which was the primary proponent of the bill that created the task force. So we will begin this work, and I'm going to hand it over to Susan Lloyd.
Unmuting myself. Good morning. I'm Susan Lloyd. I run a small consulting firm that specializes in process design and facilitation, working on social justice issues. So I'm very pleased to be here this morning. I'd like everyone to introduce themselves, and when they do, to say who they are, where they're from, how they think they got involved in this project, and something that no one else would know about them. And I suppose for me, it would be that I delivered mail and ran a rock and roll store to get myself through college. So, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lisa Schneider. I would mute, Susan. Thanks. Mute myself. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So my name is Lisa Schneider-Fabes. I'm working with Susan on this project. I too am an independent consultant, really excited to be here. One thing that I'm a co-facilitator, and one thing that people would not know about me is that in the late 80s, I was a motorcycle riding Peace Corps volunteer in Guatemala doing agroforestry. And I am going to turn it over now to Bob Berlin to introduce himself.
I think Bob has not yet joined us.
How about Ari Jones?
She is here.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ari Jones. I am Senior Policy Advisor at the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. I got involved with this because I was the principal drafter for the prosecutor-initiated resentencing law that just went into effect in the state on January 1st. And one thing that people may not know about me is that I was born and raised in Alabama. And I will pass it to Joby.
Good morning. My name is Joby Cates, and I'm part of this task force because Restore Justice was involved with the legislative sponsors in conceiving of the idea for the task force, largely because we have work with a large number of individuals who are serving life or de facto life sentences for things they did before they grew up in the state of Illinois. And one thing people might not know about me is I have a black belt.
So why don't you turn it over to somebody?
All right, I'll turn it over to Representative Cassidy.
Hi, I am Kelly Cassidy, State Representative of the 14th District, was the lead sponsor of the prosecutor-initiated resentencing, as well as the prior, I don't know how many versions of it until we landed on this one. And something people might not know about me, other than that my dog outweighs me, is that I grew up on an island in Florida, and I don't eat seafood in the Midwest because of that. And I'll pass it to Robert Peters.
Hello, I'm Robert, and I was the sponsor in the Senate. I feel like I need to remember the order of these things so I can get this right. What is something I could say that people don't know about me in general? I love soccer. I am nerdishly about soccer. That I am obsessed with soccer. Like, it's just weird. I can't do math, and the only geometry I can do is soccer. All right, I am done rambling about that right now this morning. Am I supposed to just do anybody in sort of a random fashion? I don't know if Ryan Spain is gone at all, or I'm going to just hand it over to you to take on there.
Sure. Thanks, Senator. Hi, my name is Ryan Spain, State Representative for the 73rd District. I live in Peoria. I was asked to be a part of this task force from my friend on the other side of the aisle, our great former majority leader, Barbara Flynn Curry. And we collaborated on a number of things, working together across the aisle. So happy to join the task force and look forward to our work together. Something that people may not know about me, in addition to being a state legislator, I am a big drummer. So I'm an excellent drummer and have played in bands growing up throughout my life and even in Europe. So with that, I will see if the other member of the General Assembly that's with us, Senator Darren Bailey, is available next.
Hey, good morning, sir. I am and honored to be a part of this group. My name is Darren Bailey. Down here where I'm at, you may not know the small towns. Louisville is my hometown. It's 30 minutes south of Effingham. And yes, when I was asked to be a part of this task force, I was excited about that because, in order to get Illinois turned around, obviously, we need to look at all aspects. And it's interesting because here on our farm, many times we hire men and mostly men with the work who come out of the prison system and they can't get a job. So no, I'm interested in seeing what we can do to change some of that. A little known fact, I have served on the short stints of time on the mission field in Panama, Romania, Russia, and in the at the White Mountain Apache Reserve in Arizona. So thank you so much, and I look forward to getting to know you and working with you guys. And I'm sorry, if I was supposed to pass it on, I'm going to have to pass and let the host do that. So I didn't take a record of the names of people on here. I apologize.
So why don't we have, let's see, is Sharon Mitchell on the call yet?
Hey, I'm here.
Great.
Thank you all so much. First off, don't need the spotlight. I'm working on the beard. Please bear with me. Sharon Mitchell Jr., Cook County Public Defender. Thank you all so much for having me. I'm accompanied by one of our senior attorneys, Jim Jacobs, who is a supervisor in our Legal Resources Division. So thank you so much, Jim, for taking so much out of your time out of your day to join us. I think I'm here because we at the Public Defender's Office represent the vast majority of people in the criminal justice system from Cook County, whether they're criminal, juvenile, charged juvenile, traffic, all types of criminal offenses. One thing that folks don't know about me, maybe a few do, but me and Kathy are both garden dorks, so we love our gardens. We are on our off season, but I'm sure we both have stacks of seed magazines and getting ready for the harvest, getting ready for the season. So thank you all so much for having me. I will pass it on to Shobha.
Good morning, everybody. Hi, I'm Shobha Mahadev. I'm at the Children and Family Justice Center at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law. And I think I'm here because I've been working, I've been focused for a long time on a population of especially young people and young adults who've been sentenced for very long periods of time and worked a lot on resentencing hearings. So I'm excited to see where that work goes. And we've been involved in those policy conversations along with Restore Justice as well, and many of you. One thing I think folks may not know about me, and I'm super embarrassed to share with all of you, is that I am part of a History Day championship cohort out of California from my high school days. So yes, we participated in history competitions. I will pass it to Scott Main.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Scott Main. I am a staff attorney with the Illinois Juvenile Defender Resource Center, which is a subset of the Office of the State Appellate Defender. I think one of the reasons I'm here is that conversations about second chances, second looks, obviously bring up questions of sort of constitutionality and you know, what is possible and sort of what would be sort of acceptable, and I like to nerd out on whatever legal question is presented. So I think that's something that I was picked to be a part of this process for that. And when I was gonna, you know, share my little known fact about being born in Altoona, Pennsylvania, I started to wonder about why we're being, you know, sharing these little known facts about ourselves. Like I do have some suspicion about identity theft. So the thing that I'm going to go with is that although I've tried as long as I can to stay off of all forms of social media as much as possible, I did run a Twitter account for about 6 or 7 years. So that is the dirty little secret in my past.
So I think Latoya Hughes hasn't gone yet. Latoya, are you with us?
I am. Do you have me? Good morning. My name is Latoya Hughes. I am Chief Inspector with the Illinois Department of Corrections. So I'm here as a representative of the Illinois Department of Corrections. I am also an attorney and was previously a supervisor in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. So I believe that is why I was selected to represent the Illinois Department of Corrections in this conversation. One little known fact about me is that I am a vegetarian. And I will turn it over to, let's see, has Assistant Public Defender James Jacobs gone?
I have not, but I'm not a stakeholder.
All
All right, you might be a stakeholder, but not a member of the task.
Right.
I think who we're missing is Chief Davis.
All right, Chief Davis.
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mitchell Davis. I'm the police chief in the village of Hazelcrest, and I'm not sure why I'm here, but I think I'm here because I'm the president of the Illinois Chiefs Association. That's one suspicion. It might be others, but happy to be here and work with you all. I guess a little known fact, well, many people may not know it, is that prior to going into law enforcement, I actually went to Illinois Institute of Technology and was a computer programmer for 8 years prior to getting in law enforcement in 1991. So some may or may not know that, but that's my little known fact.
And then I think I don't see Yaakov Delaney on the screen, but is he here?
Yaakov has not joined us yet. He's going to be a little bit late. He's at an event with the Lieutenant Governor right now. So
I think, is there any task force member that we missed? Okay. I think we're going to turn it over to Kathy now.
All righty. I'm going to talk a little bit about the goals and deliverables of this task force, and we look, of course, to the legislation for the baseline of we are to submit a report if we can get the work done by July 1st with recommendations for the quote innovative use of resentencing motions, and specifically by individuals and stakeholders other than state's attorneys. So that's our big picture goal and deliverable. But in terms of what we want to accomplish, obviously, we want to accomplish a report that's useful and understandable and user-friendly and is actually going to be of help in the policy-making decisions that will be made going forward. Too many task force reports sit on the shelf and never get implemented. And I can say that as a former member of the Ronner Commission and as the executive director of the Sentencing Commission, which tracked implementation of those recommendations. There were some that got implemented, but not a lot. So the other baseline calculation we have is reducing the prison population. And as you'll see later on, when we look at our prison population as it is today, it's very different than it was just even 5 or 6 years ago. So we are going to have to be looking at the whole population and setting aside one of the things that is frequently done, which is carving out people with violent offenses from reforms. And I recognize that there's difficulty there. But I think when we look at our members, we have a range of stakeholder viewpoints, and that is key to having a really good substantive discussion. I will note that we do have some vacancies on our task force. We do not yet have the 3 retired judges that the governor is appointing, but that is in process. And sadly, we lost Aditi Singh, who had been appointed by the Alliance for Safety and Justice to represent the victims' viewpoint. So we are in a search for her replacement. If anyone has a name that they'd like to suggest, please go ahead and get that to me. So you come to the table, and I'll just say that we are coming to this table, everyone with an equally valuable voice. And one of the reasons that I think a good facilitator is important is to make sure that everybody expresses their viewpoints and uses their voice. So for the housekeeping function as the administrative support for this, we do need to adopt some policies and procedures, which all of you received in the materials that were sent to you. And don't worry, I don't assume that you read them, but I will take, that's only because I don't always read what I get for these types of meetings. I do want to point out a couple of things that are perhaps a little bit different than policies and procedures and groups that you've participated in the past. One is that the procedures allow for the use of proxies and designees This is because we have a short timeline and we need to be able to establish quorum and have votes when we get to the point of adopting recommendations. So if one of you can't attend, you can either provide your proxy vote to the chairman, who is yet to be appointed, or designate via email to me that you are appointing somebody as your designee. So they'll count for quorum and they'll be able to vote. There is a provision in there that we agree that the discussions, in order to foster open and honest discussion, that the statements that are made in the course of these meetings won't be used in political campaigns. And I know that might be hard at times, but again, we want to have a free-ranging and complete discussion. And the other thing is that, and this is a SPAC kind of thing, we are reserving the bulk of our time for members to participate in discussion. But if there is time, the chairman will have the flexibility to address the questions or comments raised by people who are joining us from the public. And that will be obviously in addition to the required setting aside of time for public comment at the end of the meeting. So that is a basic overview. The rest of the processes and procedures are pretty much the standard. We'll have motions, we'll have minutes, and we'll have organized meetings. So with that, I will ask for any questions, comments, or concerns. And I am not seeing any hands raised. You can just unmute yourselves and share if you have any of those. All right, I see no questions, comments, or concerns. So I will ask for a motion to adopt the processes and procedures.
So moved.
All right, I need a second.
Second.
All right, thank you. And now, because we are on Zoom, we got to do a roll call, folks. So here we go. Kelly Cassidy?
Yes.
Ryan Spain?
Yes.
Robert Peters?
Yes.
Darren Bailey?
Yes.
Ari Jones?
Yes.
Scott Main?
Yes.
Sharon Mitchell?
Yes.
Latoya Hughes?
Yes.
Joby Cates?
Yes.
Chief Davis?
Yes.
Shobha Mahadev?
Yes.
All right. We have a unanimous vote in support of the policies and procedures. So thank you all. I am now going to hand it over to Lisa Schneider-Fabes to give you an overview of our timeline and schedule. This is proposed, and obviously we will be happy to get your feedback on it. Take it away, Lisa.
Thanks, Kathy. So I just want to say that we are required to meet 4 times. We don't intend at this moment to add additional meetings, but if that seems to be necessary, we can. The proposed schedule's on your agenda. The dates are April 29th, March 18th, May 20th. And as Kathy said, you can send a designee. Just as one of your facilitators, I'll say that's not ideal, just because we build on the work and the discussions that we have. But we understand that at times that's necessary. According to the procedures we just voted on, if you're going to send a designee, you'll need to let the chair, who's Kathy right now, know that you will be absent. And I just want to say the report is due on July 1st, which is why we have the meetings at the intervals that we do. Susan's going to go over what's going to happen at each of those meetings. But in between meetings, what you can expect from us is meeting minutes, some background reading, and at times we'll ask a question in advance to inform the next discussion, and ask you to send your responses in advance. But none of that will be a heavy lift. Most of the substantive work will be done in our task force meetings. Like I said, we'll have a vote on the dates before we leave, but are there any questions until I turn it over to Susan to talk about the agenda today.
Can you repeat the dates?
Yes, sir. And they are also in the agenda, and we can send calendar invites if that's helpful to the task force. It's April 29th, March 18th, and May 20th. Okay, so hearing no other questions, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Susan. I will go ahead and put those invites out right now per your request. And Susan, take it away.
I'm going to step back for a minute. And before talking about today's agenda, I'd like to step back and thank the team that's put together a plan for all 4 meetings and give you a sense of what we're going to do today and where we're headed over the next several meetings so that we can, in fact, deliver a report with recommendations by July 1st. In today's meeting, we're going to clarify the scope and the charge, which we've already started to do. We're going to discuss some issues that are core to the interests of justice, and then we'll tackle some foundational questions, which I'll come back to. In meeting 2, we're really going to focus on the question of eligibility. How long would an inmate have to have served in order to be eligible for a resentencing motion? How old would he or she have to be? Is there a minimum age? What about the crime of conviction? How does that influence, or how would that be given weight in our thinking about eligibility? The 3rd meeting is going to take up legal procedural questions. How does resentencing get initiated? Who can bring a petition or a motion for resentence? And what about a right of counsel? What's our thinking about that? What's the task force thoughts about how this could actually play out in implementation? The 4th meeting will really be the culmination of the task force work together. And at that point, you will have received a draft of the report and recommendations. And our last meeting will really be about final comments on the content and the accuracy and the perspectives that are in the report and consideration of the recommendations, and hopefully an affirmation of those recommendations, which would have come out through this process. With that, let me jump back to today's meeting and say that in the discussion around the interests of justice, we want to tackle 3 basic questions. The first is, how do we weigh the many, many interests that are affected by potential changes in sentencing policy and practice? The second is, how do we incorporate new research findings, new knowledge about behavior into our thinking about the interests of justice? And then finally, how do concepts that are talked about by all of you all the time, healing, rehabilitation, redemption, how do those all factor into the work that we're doing today? And with that, I think I'm going to turn to Representatives Cassidy and Senator Peters to recall how we got here today, to talk about the why of the task force. And then Mark Powers, who is the SPAC data expert, is going to describe the Illinois prison population for us. And with that, I'm going to turn to Kelly Cassidy. She's going to talk about the background on the legislation. Kelly?
Actually, Kelly, can I have you hold for a second? We have one question from Scott Main. So Scott, why don't you give us your question before we dive into the substance?
Sure, and I apologize for not finding my raise hand feature faster. And I know that we will be talking later about the specific dates for the subsequent meetings for this task force. But I wondered if we should be having a conversation now or at that point with Aditi no longer being able to be a member of the task force. And obviously, as we're waiting for the final positions to be filled, if we should entertain a conversation about us, any sort of a delay in terms of until we have those other positions filled before we charge ahead with our second meeting. I would like us to have a conversation about where we are in terms of membership of the task force and the conversations that we're having to make sure that the perspectives of sort of everyone who's been identified as key members of this task force have been filled and are present for the conversation.
I really appreciate you mentioning that, because it's been a topic of great conversation among the members planning the task force series of meetings. And I'm going to let Kathy fill in on what our plan is after this meeting. Kathy?
Yeah, and that was a question actually that we were going to pose in the new business part of the agenda, even though it's not written on there. So I guess what I would say is I would like to hear from all of the members about your feelings about that. And obviously there's a trade-off. I think the balance would be having an incomplete set of viewpoints and a report that meets the July 1st deadline versus having some flexibility and making sure that our future meetings take place when we have our 3 judges and our crime victim representative. So I'd like to kind of put that question in the parking lot for the end of the meeting and tell you that we are working with the Lieutenant Governor's office and the Governor's office, nudging and pushing, and I'm hoping that our legislative members might also weigh in on the need to get those appointments done in an expeditious manner after we have, between now and the next meeting date. So the meeting dates are proposed, they are flexible, and we'll come to a decision about that if that's okay with everybody at the end of the meeting. And I think we'll have plenty of time since we are ahead of time on our agenda schedule. So thank you, Scott, for bringing that up and articulating that. I'll also note that Bob Berlin has joined us. Bob, you missed the opportunity to tell us a little known fact about yourself. So we'll let you do that real quick.
Good morning. It's great to see everybody, although via Zoom. A little known fact about myself. Well, I've worked in 3 counties. It's 34 years now that I've been a prosecutor. So I've learned a lot along the way, and obviously developed certain views, changed views along the way. But this is important work that we're doing, and I'm excited to be part of this group.
Thanks, Bob.
And if I could pick up on that to just say this is important work that is being undertaken here. And while we have a schedule and a plan to get to a July deadline, we don't want the schedule to drive the content or the substance or the quality of the final report. So we will, circle back on the issue of, are we on track? Do we need more people around the table? What's missing from this picture? Because we want a range of perspectives to inform the report. One of the early conversations I had with Kathy when we were talking about my facilitating this project with Lisa was that I am no substantive expert in this area. And she said, well, that's good. And that was a relief to me on some level, but it was also a comment that she made to signal that, in fact, what we really want to do is make sure that the material gets covered, that the discussions are robust, and that at the end of the day, we can hand in a report, preferably by the deadline, but hand in a report that we're all proud of and is a comprehensive look at what can be done to reduce the prison population. And with that, I'm going to turn to Kelly, Representative Kelly Cassidy, to talk about the legislation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you to Kathy and the team at SPAC and everyone for all of the very clear, intentional, thoughtful work that went into getting us to this point. So thank you for all of that. This really began, I want to say probably 8 years ago, maybe a little bit before that, in conversations around the Supreme Court decision around juvenile life without parole. And their silence on retroactivity, which sparked some conversations in the criminal law committee about, how and when we would look back. And And from that, working with Matt Jones at the State's Attorneys Association and various iterations of the Cook County State's Attorney's Office because of the changes that have happened there, we came up with the prosecutor-initiated resentencing process. But very early in that, there were a lot of folks who felt like that didn't go far enough, who were concerned that that would limit relief to folks in certain counties and not make relief available to others, and the sort of fundamental unfairness of that. And so, you know, a lot of time and Restore Justice was a big part of pulling these conversations together about what is possible. And so this year, when we revived the prosecutor-initiated bill, there was a desire to spend more time thinking about what else we can accomplish and what other methods of initiation we could accomplish. And that was the birth of the task force.
Questions, comments? I guess that was very clear. And we'll pass it on to Representative Peters. What was the intent?
I will say I don't know how I'm going to do a better job than Kelly to talk about this because that was pretty clear and straightforward. I think at the end of the day, when we're making these decisions and we're looking at the system, that we want stakeholders from a variety of different places to be able to give input. And I especially do like Rep. Cassidy, want to shout out Joby and Restore Justice for this. And I think just at the end of the day, what we want to do is come to some conclusion and a pathway around a broader form of resentencing, and to be able to hopefully, in my idealistic right now space and not my general cynical space, all of us come to a consensus around that as we come up with a report. But I think this is great. I love the diversity and the broadness of this, and I'm not as clear as Rep. Cassidy in my way of telling the story. And that's it. That's all I've got. Thank you.
Those of you in the room who have also been involved in the press for the legislation, comments? Well, hearing none, we can go to the people who are at the center of all of this and ask Mark Powers of SPAC, their data expert, to give us some background about the prison population today.
Unmute.
Okay, Mark, okay.
1 second.
All right.
There we go. Okay. Let me go back to sharing screen. For a second, I thought I was on mute, but I think I am not. So my name is Mark Powers. I'm the research director of the Illinois Sentencing Policy Advisory Council. And today I'm going to be talking about the prison population kind of as it stands right now, or as it did on June 30th, 2021. Prison population today looks fairly similar to that. So you can pretty much see this as a representative picture of the current situation at Department of Correction. What we're going to be doing is really, we're going to focus on the long-termers. And by long-termers, we're talking about are people who have been incarcerated for about 20 plus years. That will include people who have spent 20 years both in prison and pretrial as one kind of long length of stay. We're going to be looking at how that population accrued over time. And particularly, we're going to be also looking at the life sentences and treatment sentencing people in that population. Also, we're going to touch a little bit on the elderly population and how that elderly population sort of intersects or overlaps with the long-termers. Some people might be surprised there is some overlap, but it's not as definitive as some might actually think. So let's actually start with the June 30th, 2021 prison population. It's at 27,413 people. If you look at it today, I think it's pretty much right around as well. Of those 27,000 or so people, 12% of that population has been incarcerated for 20 plus years. Now that's a smaller part of the actual entire population, but when you look at the additional people who will serve 20 years, but have not yet hit that 20th year, that adds an additional 5,200 people. So now we're talking pretty close to about 8,500 people that are really in this long-term population. And when you think about that, if this task force were to really focus on efforts that really were just more prospective about people being sentenced in the future, we're not going to touch any of those 3,200 people. We're not going to touch the additional 5,200 people who have yet to serve those 20 years, but will do so before they are released from prison. But for the most part today, we're going to really focus on these 3,200 people in that dark purple pie that's kind of carved out there. So first, let's look at some kind of offense and prison characteristics for those who were convicted and sentenced to prison. On the left column, this is total population. That's the entire prison population. That includes people who are long-term, short-term, technical violators, and so forth. It's everybody that sums up to that 27,413 people. On the very right are the long-termers that we're really focusing on, that 3,235 people that have served 20 plus years. And there's kind of an in-between column there that's kind of a midway point that I'm really just going to use for a couple of points of reference to kind of show you how we should probably be thinking about the long-term population. So right off the bat, let's take a look at the offense types, right? If you look at the general population, you'll see that basically about 2/3 of the entire population are incarcerated for a violent offense. About 34% are incarcerated for some other offense, like a prison or a property or a drug crime, or maybe some other type of offense. In the long-term population, those serving 20 plus years, it actually comes out to 97% of the population. So we're talking about the vast, vast majority of people in that long-term group were convicted of basically a murder, or some sort of homicide, a violent sex offense, or some other violent offense. So when you think about the definition of long-term, there's nothing really set in statute or anything like that. Really, that says a long-term person has served 20 years versus 10 years and so forth. So let's actually broaden that definition to 10 years just to see if that population changes much in terms of the offenses that they were convicted of. And if you look at those who have served 10 years or more, which includes the 20 plus year group, it's still 95% of those people were sentenced for a violent offense. So when you think about that, there's really going to be almost no way of getting around that. I think the task force will have to basically think about people who are convicted of violent offenses first and foremost, just because that's basically how the numbers pan out. Going down the list a little bit to offense class, you'll see that basically the offense classes kind of mirror what you see in the offense types, right? So in the long-term population particularly, where we had 97% who were convicted of a violent offense, it's basically about the same amount. I think it's 96% are either class M or class X. But basically the two most severe felony classes in Illinois. There's almost nobody in the lesser felony classes 1, 2, 3, or 4. Even looking at those who've served over 10 years, you basically see the exact same picture. It's just you have another 2 or 3% who are in the lesser felony classes. So again, looking at this population, we're going to be able to looking probably at people who are convicted of class M or class X offenses. There's just not really much way around it just due to the numbers. Also then looking kind of at these specific types of sentences in terms of life, treatment sentencing, or something else. The general population is only really 6% of the population are in for a life sentence. I say only, but I mean, that's still kind of a large number when you think of it, about 1,600 people. When you go to the long-termers, that's almost a third of the population are in for a life sentence. When you look at the treatment sentencing population of the long-termers, it's actually about a third as well. And that's actually even a higher percentage of the total population, because they have not yet hit close to that 20-year mark or even that 10-year mark. That treatment sentencing population that we're going to see is going to be a big part of the growth of the long-term population now and in the future. And then the other part of the long-term population is 36%, which really, when you look at it, the people who received very long sentences that were not treatment sentencing sentences from years ago, supposed to be prior to 1998. It's very common to see people with 50, 60, 70-year sentences, sometimes being consecutive sentences, but nonetheless, they were sentenced to prison for a very long time. So moving on from the kind of offense characteristics of those who are in prison, we can take a look at what the demographics are. And I think right off the bat, one thing that kind of pops out is that the first row of facts actually is pretty consistent across the entire population. Prison population is predominantly male. if you look at the breakdown, somewhere between 3 and 5% are females. They're not going to be committing many violent offenses that can put them in prison for a very long time. The one thing that really pops out, I think, is race. If you look at the Illinois population as a whole, not the prison population, just the general public, I think it's something around 60% white and 15% black. If you look at the prison population, total population, we're talking 54% black, right? So it's very disproportionate, a lot of disproportionality there. And it comes out to about a third white. When you look at the long-termers, that disproportionality actually increases even more to where now we're talking about a population that is 2/3 black and only about 24% white. And then the other group is kind of in the middle of that. So obviously, race is probably definitely going to be a topic of this task force. The other thing that really stands out to me, and some of it was a little bit surprising when we analyzed the data, is the age characteristics. So looking at the total prison population, you'll see that the age of the total population that is under 50 is slightly over 3/4 of the population. The majority of the prison population, as it stands right now, are, I'll call them young. I'm in that group, so I like to call myself young, but we're not going to argue about that one today. But if you look at the long-term population, it's a very different picture, right? You have basically only 43% of the long-termers are under 50 years old. And the remaining 57% are basically 50 or above. You can call that the elderly group. We're going to use that definition, at least for the presentation today. But I was kind of surprised myself that 43% of the long-term population, people serving over 20 years, are still less than 50. But when you really think about it, it does kind of make sense. Because basically, for people who were incarcerated in their early 20s, even mid 20s, they probably, if they were incarcerated, unless they were incarcerated a long time ago, even longer than 20 years ago, they haven't hit the age of 50 yet. So it does kind of make sense where you still see a pretty large group in that population who are not yet 50 years old. And so they, by pretty much any definition of elderly, they would probably not count. You could see also in the average age of admission, those who have served 20+ years in prison were actually admitted at the youngest age of all three of these groups. The total overall population, the average age, it's been kind of consistent, I think, over the years, has been in around 33 years old. Whereas those who served over 20 years, it's in the high 20s, about 28 years. In terms of the county, it kind of mirrors what you would kind of expect just from the racial demographics, where Cook represents a large proportion of the long-term population, and the rural people incarcerated from rural communities represent one of the disproportionately lower population than the total population in Department of Corrections. So we really only looked kind of at a snapshot on June 30th of 2021. Let's focus on that long-term population, look and see how that group is kind of accrued over time. And that's basically what this chart shows. Again, we're talking, if you look at the very far right of the chart, you see that 3,200 kind of a limit that we're talking about of the long-term population as it stands today. And you can see the growth kind of started pretty heavily in the late 90s and 2000s, much of that kind of being the accrual of people with the more severe sentences from the kind of tough on crime era of the 80s and 90s. A couple of things we can kind of point out, past 10 years alone, the population has doubled. So that's a pretty big increase. Even prior to that, actually, it's more than doubling when you look at the 10-year intervals. But prior to that, we had about 45,000 people in prison, and now we're down to 27,000. So I think the population doubling over that time of the long-termers, when the overall population is dropping, is kind of significant. But the one group that really stands out to me is that truth and sentencing population, which is the dark purple in this chart. And truth and sentencing, very often kind of just call TIS, just for short. And the TIS growth, when you really look at it, it's much of the growth in the past 5 years or so. And to put that into perspective, let's take a look at the growth from, say, 2004 to 2012. You basically see an exact 1,000 person increase. It's not exact, it's very close to a 1,000 person increase from 2004 to 2012. So basically 8-9 years or so to increase from 1,000 people. That TIS group increased by pretty much an identical amount in less than half that time, 2018 to 2021. That's a pretty notable stark finding, I think, of just how that TIS group is actually increasing. And so a question might be, why is the TIS population rising so rapidly? And really, it's kind of by design. That's what TIS is supposed to do. TIS was basically implemented in 1998. There was a version that came prior to that that didn't last long because it was found to be unconstitutional. But we're really going to focus on the 1998 law going forward. If you look at the people who were convicted of the Class M and the Class X violent offense, 1992, 1996 was the pre-TIS era. Nobody is being incarcerated for TIS at that point in time. And you're seeing that they're serving basically in their average projected length of stay about half of what they're expected of what they were sentenced under. Basically because they're getting day for day credits, which means every day you serve in prison, you get one additional day of credit kind of offset that so that you can actually be released. And it encourages good behavior and so forth. Once you start to get the 1997 to 2001 cohorts, you now have a blend of the people who don't have TIS and those who do. And then going forward from say 2007 onwards, you're basically seeing everyone in the Class M group being sentenced for truth in sentencing, and the TIS in Class X violent offenses really ramping up to being about half of those being sentenced. By the way, the Class X violent offenses that are not truth in sentencing, I think the majority of them are going to be kind of armed robbery, but it's armed robbery without great bodily harm. If there's great bodily harm, that's also truth in sentencing. But you basically see now, prior to truth in sentencing, they were serving about 50% of what they were actually sentenced to, and now they're serving basically the entire sentence for Class offenses. Class X, it's gone from basically half to about a little over, I'd say 2/3 overall. And that's basically what TIS was intended to do by design. It may not have actually been intended to do that in principle. I think when TIS really started, the expectation was that judges would adjust their sentencing so that those who were getting a TIS sentence going forward would actually get a reduced sentence to account for the fact that they were serving, to basically make them serve the same amount of time in prison as those who didn't get TIS. That adjustment by judges never happened. They kept their sentencing constant, and as a result, those serving TIS sentences are serving a much, much longer amount of time in prison compared to those who did not get a truth in sentencing sentence. Let's actually transition now to the elder population. We're actually going to tie these two together, the sentencing and the elder population in a second. But just looking at what we're kind of quote unquote calling elderly, we're using age 50 plus for the purposes of today's presentation. You can do 55 plus, 60 plus. If you use any of those other groups, really what just happens is these charts just kind of shrink downward. The overall kind of patterns are pretty similar depending on which age group you look at. We have reduced this elderly population since 2015, but we're still looking at over 5,000 people in a population of 27,000 people right now. And also, when you look at the percent of the population that are basically made up of this elderly group, that percent is actually going up still. And the reason basically is because the other groups has actually shrank at a faster rate in the elderly population, making the elderly population percent basically just continue to increase. But just basically, keep in mind that 2015 number of 7,000 people, you may be wondering, well, if this elderly population went down, did the people with the long sentences in that group go down as well? So let's go ahead and take a look at that. This is that exact same group, elderly population. You'll see that 2015 bar column reached that same 7,000 people, right? But this is that group divided out by what their sentence range was. So you have under 20 years, 20 to 39, 40 plus years, and life sentences. Pretty much all the change in that population is in that under 20 years group. The pink, the purple, and the black parts of those columns, those aren't going down. Those are basically going up or staying the same. The only real movement in this entire picture are those with the shorter sentences under 20 years. So our entire elder population change really has not been in the long term. In all in the people who some are spending a significant amount of time in prison, but they're not spending over 20 years in prison. It's really just the people with the shorter amounts of stay. This is really focusing though on the kind of elder population as the kind of base population. But we could actually kind of slice and dice the population, look at this a different way. We could actually look at those with long-term sentences as the kind of denominator and check to see how those long-term sentences are divided by the elder population and the non-elder population over time. So let's go ahead and do that. Here you see on the very right, we're talking about the 3,200 people that we mentioned in the first slide on June 30, 2021. And one thing you can see here is, one, that long-term population, the two bars combined, not going down at all. It's continuing to go up. And actually, it's gone up even kind of substantially, I think, in just 1 year from 2020 to 2021. But also within the bar for each color, those aren't going down either. They might be changing a little bit in terms of what proportion they are of the total group. But basically, the long-term age 50 plus group, those columns are increasing, and the long-term age under 50 are also increasing. So there's really, I would say, from my perspective, not much good news in this picture. I think then that's kind of what we really wanted to focus on showing. I kind of want to conclude though, with these two charts though, when we talk about the elderly population and the long-term population, we can't really talk about those two as being the exact same population. They're really not, because really you have about 47%, I think it was, of the long-term population is not yet really elderly by pretty much any definition. The other kind of conclusions, I think, kind of emphasizing that when we look at this entire population, I think the task force will be focusing on, it's going to be primarily people who are convicted of violent offenses. It's just the way property and drug sentencing is done in Illinois. Even if they get long-term sentences, they're probably going to get day for day, which means they're going to be out in way under 20 years for the most part. And that 20-year group is currently at about 3,200 people, but on top of that, we still have another 5,200 people or so that are going to be added to that group over time. So any prospective changes that go on to apply to future sentences have no chance of touching those people. So the only way you're going to touch those people with any sort of meaningful reforms to have them be released a little bit earlier would be something retroactive. And I think I kind of beat the kind of overlap on the elderly and the long-term population dead horse. So let's go ahead and, if anybody has any questions, I can go ahead and entertain any questions.
Joby's hand is raised. Shoba's.
Mark, I have a question. First of all, thank you for putting together this analysis. It's really useful to start with data. And I guess my question is this, it's based on an observation. Over the past 10 or 12 years, really since Miller v. Alabama in 2012, which is Representative Cassidy mentioned, as we've been doing similar research to what you just presented, looking at the Department of Corrections data sets and numbers, and comparing it with sort of the types of cases that are coming in as cases where people are convicted of violent offenses. I'm curious, and I think I already know the answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway, just in case, that some people who are convicted of violent offenses are convicted as sort of accountable co-defendants. Mm-hmm. Others are convicted with charges such as felony murder, where they were participating in perhaps an underlying forcible felony that resulted in an unanticipated death, and they then are charged with first-degree murder. We know that there are a large percentage of people, we don't know what that percentage, but based on sort of our legal networks, we know that not everyone who is labeled a violent offender has in fact directly committed a violent crime. We also don't necessarily have data on, or maybe we do, for example, previous offenses that are also violent. So when we call someone a violent offender, or we say we're counting violent offenses and we have to include violent offenses, I think there's a sense that all of these folks are the same. And I'm wondering the extent to which data can reveal any nuance inside that broader category.
I unfortunately have some bad news in that the data that we typically look at really doesn't have that information. We've actually been kind of toying with some ideas of actually getting that, particularly, for example, on the accountability thing. We have multiple co-defendants, and really there's probably something like 2 or 3 people in a car where there's a robbery and one person pulled the trigger while one other person is driving, maybe just one other person in the back seat. All those people in the car would be convicted of, if there was, for example, homicide in that situation, they'd be convicted of homicide. In our data for the prison population, we don't really know that. We are kind of teasing some ways to get at least some estimates of that. For example, I think there's kind of a feature in court case numbers for some counties, in particular Cook County, where you can kind of tell if a case has multiple co-defendants based on the last digit of the case number. It's either like a 1, 2, or 3. I don't know exactly if it's going to work out perfectly, but that's something we're kind of looking at. In terms of basically, the labeling of what we consider to be a violent offender versus not a violent offender, we could look at criminal history, but it's really in the Department of Corrections data. We could also look at prior incarcerations in that. But a lot of that data is unfortunately kind of just not in the present data we have access to. But SPAC and probably some other organizations will look at the existing data that we have. That's not only with the Department of Corrections, with the CRI data and the CRI data being the Illinois State Police Criminal History Database, as well as maybe circuit clerk data to try to see if we can tease some of that stuff out. I think I answered that question.
May I just shoot in a quick follow-up, and then Shobha Mahadev has her hand up. My quick follow-up is this. So the other nuance that it might be interesting to utilize is that there are people who serve less time for the same offenses, such as Class M and Class X. And those are people who perhaps are working throughout their trial. Perhaps they accept a plea deal and they receive a lesser sentence as a result of cooperating with the prosecution or some other factors. Those folks are people who are convicted of the same offense as a person who's serving, say, 45 years for a double homicide with a gun, or that's a single homicide with a gun. A double with a gun would be 65 years, right? And then a person who might perhaps cooperate might walk away with some lesser amount of time. When we look at this from a public safety point of view, is there a way to use an analysis of the people who are actually released sooner for similar offenses based on a deal?
We wouldn't know that if there was a deal in the case. We would know, though, for those who say run a much lower range of the offense imposed for those particular offenses. So, I mean, we might actually be able to take a sample, for example, of those who say got a very low sentence relative to other people for a Class X violent offense, a Class M offense, and basically check to see. It would be basically probably look at individual case records in that situation. We'll probably also maybe appellate decisions, those types of things as well. It's that type of nuance is typically not present in the typical data that we use, basically the administrative data, that is. But this task force, I mean, if it's possible or we think it's feasible to actually turn something around to where the task force could actually use it in a timely manner, it's something we could definitely look into. I'm very actually happy that you're asking this question, because I forgot to mention initially, this is just kind of our first attempt to kind of lay out a kind of a broad picture of the prison population on that issue of the elderly group and the long-term group, just because that's really kind of what we think the focus might be initially based off of some other efforts and legislation in Illinois. But if any of the task members have any particular questions, they should go ahead, or data requests, that is, they should just go ahead and make them. And if we can fulfill those requests, we'll go ahead and do so.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for that excellent presentation. I'm hoping everyone can hear me. So I guess my question is a follow-up. I first want to echo Joby's concern about that data point that we at Northwestern also struggled to get when we were studying the lifer population, especially the young people who are, juvenile lifers and emerging adults in that category, that it was difficult to figure out these other possible permutations like accountability, felony murder, that the charging documents might give us some clues. And so I think it would be helpful to have that nuance. The other question, though, that I have related to that is, what is the definition in this presentation or in the charts you have used with regard to violent offenders? Like, what does that actually mean? We've recognized that there's some nuance in terms of actual role and participation, but are there other nuances, for example, possession versus use of a gun or anything like that? Like, what does violent mean in this context?
SPAC's definition pretty much aligns with the Victims of Crime Act. I think that's what it's called. Kathy, you can correct me if I'm wrong. It's either Victims of Crime Act or Victims of Violent Crime Act. I think it's the Victims of Crime Act. That basically kind of specifies what would be considered violence. There's definitely differences across agencies in what they consider violence. I think, for example, the Department of Corrections would also include weapons offenses as violence. We actually don't. We put those in a separate category. So basically, if it's just simple gun possession, that's not considered a violent offense in our categorization. If it's something like ag discharge of a firearm, that would be. I think also some of the sex offenses, there'll be some differences. I'm not positive which ones are different between the two groups. About a year ago, we did a comparison with the Department of Corrections. We could look at that kind of, when we send out some more additional data, we can send a little more detailed information about what we consider violence. But it mostly aligns with that statute, with the Illinois, I think it's the Victims of Crime Act.
Thank you. That's super helpful. And really, thank you for this presentation. I think the piece about truth in sentencing is also sort of fascinating to observe, and that elderly population piece.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Other questions about the prison population? Well, let me invite a few people to say a word or two about their perspective. And Jody, let me start with you. Joby?
Oh, Joby, yes, sorry. What would you?
Well, I know that you have been working around this set of issues for many, many years. And on hearing the description of the prison population, what are the sort of nuances that you would bring to the mix in addition to what you've already highlighted?
Oh, thank you. Well, I think it's interesting always to look at, I think the broader picture that Mark just presented, which is that the prison population has been going down. And that was a very intentional effort started by Governor Rauner as part of the work that Kathy Saltmarsh mentioned earlier. And the strategies that were employed really were focused on, so you kind of quote unquote nonviolent offenders. And so folks who are doing shorter terms were getting a bit quicker turnaround on earning their time off for good behavior, coming home. Some sentences were simply, sorry. What I guess what I want to say is that as we watch this other percentage of people grow, so people who are sentenced after truth in sentencing was enacted in 1998, people who are sentenced and who go to trial, people who actually fight their case, are subject to the mandatory sentence. The judge doesn't have discretion. And when we get to the point where someone's gone to trial, I sort of ask myself, why? Why did they choose to go to trial when they know they could get less time? And strictly anecdotally, and knowing hundreds of people who have fought these kinds of cases and are now serving these long sentences, and their family members, many of them either didn't truly understand their role in the offense, or they were absolutely understood their role in the offense and played a role in the offense, but they were young and not quite all together yet. We seek to sort of look at the impact of taking that many people, really thousands of people who are not in the category of sort of the folks that I think people think of when they think of someone serving a life or a de facto life sentence, which is somebody who's really scary, somebody who's irredeemably violent, who's just not safe to be in community. We're looking at a lot of people serving that sentence who don't fit that description. And I feel like I know that in my bones because I've spent a lot of time in prisons and visiting rooms and with family members, with people who are 10, 20, 30 years away from their offense. And I'm not, suggesting that everyone fits that category, but I think quite a few do. And so when we look at this picture, I don't want to base things on assumptions. So I'm hoping some of the data that we can work with throughout this commission can support the notion that looking at people, as individuals who at a slice of time, at a moment in time, made a big mistake, or involved in a terrible situation, or did something really truly harmful to another person, that we're actually going back and looking at the consequence of having people face a mandatory minimum where their individuality cannot be considered. That is fundamentally wiping out any opportunity they would ever have for redeeming themselves and for rehabilitating and rejoining community. I also just want to note, the only other thing that really popped out to me is the going back in Truth in Sentencing and the removal of parole in the late 1970s are the two sort of big driving factors of this lack of a safety valve that we have in our system. We just don't have a safety valve for people who really have changed and who really have rehabilitated. As sentence lengths have gone up, these opportunities for release aren't there. There's no incentive for people who are in prison or for the prisons themselves to help them, for them to help themselves or for them to be helped. And yet we're still seeing people grow and develop and mature. I like to think that the General Assembly back in the 90s didn't intend this. They intended to reduce crime. Their intention with Truth in Sentencing was to deter crime. They wanted safer streets. And this felt like a good way to do it. And they did it. And I would argue, again, we have to look at the data to test my assumption. I would argue that it didn't solve crime to lock people up for decades and decades, when we know people age out of crime, typically by the time they're a little bit older and they've matured. But keeping people in prison decades after, it hasn't deterred crime. We're living in that situation right now. So I will stop there. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Joby. I'd be interested in hearing the perspective of a state's attorney. So Bob Berlin, I would really enjoy hearing your thoughts about the presentation and the comments that Joby's just made.
So it's what's interesting to me is, the state's attorneys generally have taken the position that when it comes to violent crime, that's kind of where we drew the line in terms of sentencing reform, in terms of restorative justice, and all the programs that a lot of which we have fought for and agreed upon. And it appears that obviously the overwhelming majority of people in prison are there for violent crimes. There's a few things I want to point out. And I know we're looking at data, or we'd like to have data as to what the facts of these cases were. But you also have to look at the victims' side of things. Who are the victims in these cases? And I can just tell you from my own experience, some of these crimes, the horrific crimes, communities do not forget years and years later. And if I just want to share very quickly, the Tommy Kokorales case, a very high profile case. He was the co-defendant who actually pled guilty before a retrial. He took 70 years, day for day. So it was 35 years later in 2019 when he was due to be released. And there were hundreds of people in Elmhurst and Villa Park who called or emailed the Elmhurst police and my office. How can this be? How can he get out? It was a horrible case. And the only point of that is 35 years later, communities don't forget. And his release had a huge impact on the community. So it's something that has to be considered. The problem with trying to categorize cases, as we know, every case is different. Yeah, there's accountability, but some offenders are more accountable than others. Their involvement in the offense is greater than others. And one of the points that was brought out, the whole concept of plea bargaining. We have to look at the whole law of contracts here too. In many of these cases, deals were made. Certain offenses may have been dropped. With the involvement of the victims in these cases. The victims we communicate with them. They know what the offers are. And then we're going to come in years later and change a sentence. So that's something that I think we all have to be cognizant of, is the effect of these crimes on the community, even years later, and the involvement of victims, even years after the fact. It's an important consideration. That's all I would bring up.
Thank you. What I'm hearing is that there's some need to have a deeper understanding of the population with respect to the nature of the crime and their culpability for that particular crime. Were they the direct perpetrator, or were they someone who happened to be for whatever reason in the wrong place at the wrong time? I guess the thing that I am trying to better understand myself, and will get educated by all of you, is, are we talking about, when we talk about an individual case, is that an outlier, or is that reflective of the more general issue? And so that's the other thing for me, is to try and better understand, when the interest of justice is the topic of discussion, what's the general population, as opposed to the extraordinary or the outlier. So we can come back to it, but thank you for that. And I appreciate you bringing the victim's perspective into the mix. Anyone else want to comment on the prison population?
Chief Davis has his hands up. Chief Davis?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on this. State's Attorney Berlin just brought up one of the points that I was going to bring up, which is the victim's perspective, and making sure absolutely that we do not forget, and we aren't, but that the focus does not totally remove the victim and the trauma that they have been exposed to and will be exposed to oftentimes when we're talking about sentences of this length for the rest of their lives, and them and their family. So I want to make sure I mention that again. But for me, and this might not be a traditional law enforcement stance, but for me, another major thing is the equitable imposition or imposing sentences in an equitable manner. We saw the numbers, and as far as race was concerned, and that there are some disparities, glaring disparities as far as race is concerned. And I would be interested in knowing, so we see the numbers that we saw, but how they actually became so skewed, I guess would be the best way to say it, from a racial standpoint. If there was some deeper dives that we can do into statistics to find out, why are folks of different races that are getting convicted of the same type of crimes from a minority standpoint so disproportionately, getting more, what's the cause behind that? So I think we really have to look at that. Mandatory minimums, I think mandatory minimums is something that was also hit upon, that this takes away the individuality that may exist within a particular incident, that there may be extenuating circumstances that and that removes that from the table. And how does that, once again, how is that applied from a racial disparity standpoint? And one thing is talking about people maturing and being rehabilitated. I think that we cannot have this discussion, and this is just my opinion. I think we cannot have this discussion without ensuring that part of this process and part of this resentencing process and this whole to do it the right way is to make sure that we give proper resources to folks while they are locked up, to make sure that they are given the opportunity to better themselves. And I've visited prisons with people that I've mentored, with youth groups that I've had, and I know people who worked in them, and I talk to the people while I'm in there. I talk to the people who are in there, and they talk about the lack of programs and systems that, this is, I guess this is the systemic part that we need to address as well, and systems that prevent them from getting better. I went to Joliet, I think it was, and they had a barber college there, and they were talking about how, out of all the people in here, only, and I'm just making a number up, but it was something like maybe 10 people get a chance to go through this barber program. And it's been proven that the people that get to go through this are productive. They got something to lose while they're in here. It gives them a skill, but nobody else gets a chance to come through that program unless one of these guys gets out or something happens to them, they do something wrong and they get kicked out of the program, but it's so limited. And then the guy kind of ended up, who was running the program, saying, you know what, they discontinued the program. And so, I don't think that we can fully address this from a holistic standpoint and making sure that we're hitting all angles without making sure that while we're talking about, reevaluating sentencing, that while they're in there, that we're giving them the tools that they need to do to come out to be productive, and that there are those obstacles, like if you got a conviction, you can't get a barber's license, or something like that's crazy. So we're making sure we remove those obstacles as well. So no, I was kind of all over the place, but just wanted to share a couple viewpoints. So thank you.
Well, I hope we'll do a deep dive into some of what you've said in the second and third meetings. I appreciate the perspective. I think Scott and then Shobha.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I think I'm also going to be all over the place. So I mean, the first thing I wanted to agree with State Attorney Berlin, that I think that victims' voice and perspective can and should be heard, and Illinois has taken steps to make sure that happens, both through statutory provisions and a constitutional amendment. Whatever this task force sort of agrees upon, we have a mechanism in place to ensure that they will be an active participant in whatever does go forward. I always want to make sure that we're sounding the alarm or whatever the noise would be, that we we can't always be thinking about policy via anecdote, and I think that it's important to make sure that we're following the science, we're following the analysis that SPAC puts out, that talks about sort of what is effective policy and sort of what does work in terms of achieving what I think we all want to achieve, which is to create safer communities. And sort of also on that note, letting someone return home to a community that is rehabilitated, that is ready to lead a productive life, makes communities safer. That we are not improving community safety by keeping someone removed from the community who is ready to return. And the last note that I just wanted to sound is that I think it is important that we not put to the side the question of those who pled guilty to receive the sentence that they had. If our criminal legal system operates with, if take whatever number you want, the one I see recently is 95% of dispositions are going on via guilty plea versus trial. That is a huge number that cannot be relegated to the side by virtue of the choice to plead rather than go to trial. That people talk about the notion that sort of guilty plea, our guilty plea system is often seen as sort of, you can call it, the one time that you can be punished in a way by exercising your Sixth Amendment right to a fair and open trial. And the only way to avoid that punishment is to take a guilty plea. And so to leave those who have pled guilty out of this conversation would be to sort of twice punish someone who did not, take full and fair advantage of their Sixth Amendment rights. So I just want to make sure that we keep them in the conversation. And obviously the notion of sort of what the prosecutors have given up in order to allow that guilty plea to go forward is critical, and we can't ignore that. But we cannot simply not address those individuals by virtue of the process that entered them into our Department of Corrections.
Hi, hi everyone. Thank you for this thoughtful discussion. And I wonder if we're already in the discussion portion. It sounds like it. I just wanted to also give a shout out to R.A. Jones for thank you for posting that report on disparities. We saw similar disparities when we studied juvenile life without parole sentences, actually very high disparities. 80% of that population or so we found to be basically Black and brown men. And so I think that's worth highlighting and noting. And I think on the other points, one is that I think and I'm looking forward to when we have a representative from a victim and survivor community on this task force, because I don't believe these communities, victims, that we can speak of them as monoliths or to speak about any of them. Everyone's experience is individual. I had an experience a couple years ago at a resentencing hearing post Miller versus Alabama, where the family that had been, irreparably harmed by the crime in that case, it was a fire, had felt that they were both surprised by the lengthy sentence given to the individual who was involved, and felt that maybe he wasn't the most involved of the folks who had committed that, that crime, and they felt terrible about it. And they also felt that they weren't in that moment, this was a while ago, properly informed in the process. And so we worked with them to inform them, even though we represented the defendant in that case. And we had a moment in the courtroom there where we all looked up and they were hugging the family of the individual who was, receiving that hearing. And that's because they felt the process did not provide the opportunity to have that moment of reconciliation and understanding until then. And so I think anything we do, we have to be mindful that communities, victims, folks who go through this process as defendants or incarcerated individuals are not monoliths, that they're all going to approach this differently and may have different perspectives on what justice looks like for them. And so I think we just have to be aware of that. And I agree with, I think someone made a statement earlier about providing opportunities for that moment of reconciliation, redemption, remorse. Sometimes that initial trial, especially when I work with young people, that initial sentencing is not that moment. They have not arrived at that place as a matter of maturity and reflection, and the system in fact tells them that they have to remain silent, and that they should not violate their rights. And so that opportunity for remorse and reflection, which may be so important to a victim's or a survivor family, is not reached until a moment after sentencing. So I think we have to be aware that we might want to provide those opportunities in whatever processes that we look at.
Thank you. I'm going to take your opening comment and suggest that we have, in fact, sort of moved into a discussion. And so when we think about the interests of justice, I think we have to think about the community's fear and concerns, the families of the incarcerated, the victims. The system needs to resolve cases quickly. Healing versus punishment is also something that we need to take up. What I'd like to do is go ahead and take the break. When we come back and officially go into the discussion about the interests of justice, I'd like to start off with Sharon and Ari, who have comments to make. So let's take a 15-minute break. Please be back at 10 of 11. Thank you.
Say again?
Video is off, right?
Hold on.
Hi, Jean.
Hi, how are you, Kathy?
I'm good.
Sorry, I'm going to mute myself because you
Go
can hear
right
my
ahead.
dog barking.
Okay, as members rejoin, please turn on your cameras so I can tell that you're back. And we'll get started in a few minutes. Senator, how are you?
Oh, I'm enjoying the weather of Southern Illinois, so things are melting. So thank you. I hope everything's okay where you're at weather-wise.
12 inches and it's not melting, but that's okay.
Wow, we had a lot of ice down here. So, but anyway, it's starting to go away. So thank you. I appreciate this, what I'm hearing. So thank you very much.
Oh, good. Thanks. All right, we're going to get started here in just a minute. We have a couple of members back. Joby, Chief. We need a few more. Scott Main is back. Senator Bailey's back. Shoba.
I'm back.
All right.
Okay, I'd like to turn this over to Public Defender Sharon Mitchell to kick off our conversation with the comment that you were chomping at the bit to make at the last, before the break.
Yeah, I actually think that Shoba and Scott and Chief Davis actually covered a lot of what I was going to say. I think that we have real questions about whether we can get to the real rehabilitation space that Chief Davis is longing for when we have a system at this size. And a real question of, do we have the luxury to holding so many people for so long if we want to get to where we should be at rehabilitation? I also think that the Shoba's point is, I think, is really interesting, and really wish that we had, in the future meetings, we'll be able to talk to a multitude of folks from the victim side. I think often in these spaces, victims are seen as a monolith. They're invoked to typically back more punitive, more traditional lengths of punishment, and
unfortunately, we are in a place today in Illinois where there is a multitude of victims, and many of those folks, I think, um, certainly want to see people behind bars, but there are also people that want to see their communities um, be better, and they want to work on forgiveness. They want to work on restorative justice. So I'm just really happy that we will be in a place at some point to really talk about the multitude of perspectives and really talk about what we can do in terms of the size of our system to get to the place where we can truly provide rehabilitation because we are not there now.
Well, on that point, I wonder if Kathy, you would be willing to jump in and talk a little bit about the many interests that are affected by the work that we're doing, that are potentially affected by the work that we're doing, and how you think about those multiple stakeholders and their interests.
I would be happy to, but we do actually have Ari Jones also in our queue. So Ari, let's get your comment first.
Well, thank you. First, again, thank you all for just such a really thought-provoking conversation so far. I just wanted to add to what everyone else has said, noting that when we're discussing the interests of justice, like what that means, what that should look like going forward, I think we really need to both understand and incorporate the realities of what the root causes of crime are. So we have to couch these things in their historical context and in their current context. So the poverty, the lack of opportunities, dispossession, the historic and current interplays between race, socioeconomic status, and the criminal legal system all have to really be interwoven into the work that we are trying to do. And of course, the work that the legislature tries to do going forward in remedying some of our historically punitive policies. Too often, we are using the criminal legal system as a way to simply ignore greater societal issues, and we're directing our very finite resources to housing the products of these larger issues. So that can be things like unresolved traumas, untreated and undiagnosed mental illnesses, again, abject poverty. So for instance, during the 2020 fiscal year, the Joliet Treatment Center, where the state's seriously mentally ill inmates are housed, spent approximately $177,000 per inmate. And there are about 200 folks who are incarcerated there. Similarly, for fiscal year 2020, Stateville spent about $51,000 per inmate. This is compared to Illinois' public education spending, which on average is between $13,000 to $16,000 per school year per public school student. And so as we direct those resources to other places, we have to understand that we are putting our money where we think our priorities are, instead of actually putting our money to addressing some of those root causes, greater educational opportunities, greater equity in our communities that would actually lessen the need for folks to be incarcerated in the first place. To the point about the victims, I absolutely believe that every victim has a right to have their voice heard, to have it seriously considered. But I also know that there is a way to balance the desires of victims for some subjective form of justice with an objective justice. And I think that is the role of practitioners in the legal field, and especially in the criminal legal field. Based on the science, both the information that Scott has shared today, based on the reading that so many of us have done in our own work, we know that extremely long sentences don't adequately address or advance what justice is and should be, despite the many anecdotal stories we may all have that show that there is still great pushback and great desire for largely punitive sentences. But again, as Scott, was it Scott or Mark? I think it was actually Mark noted when he was doing his presentation on data, when Truth in Sentencing was adopted in 1998, the thought was that jurists would modify their sentences, and that has not come to pass. They've not given shorter sentences with the understanding that people will then spend the entirety of that shorter sentence in prison. And so we certainly have to take into account the ways that the changes in the law and the changes in our thinking have not melded historically. And so I just think each of those things has to also be a factor in what we do here and going forward.
Great. All right, well, let me just share. I'm going to kind of pick out the themes that I heard this morning. And also, whoops, am I on mute? No, I'm okay. Also, frame our discussion going forward as what Ari just said, looking at objective justice and a 10,000-foot view, because we have our local jurisdictions that are responsible for individual justice in individual cases. We hope that in those cases, the evidence that is critical to understanding both the characteristics of the individual and the characteristics of the crime, which are supposed to be the two pillars of sentencing, that those get brought forth. But we know that the system is stressed, and frequently the way that we get to that is by agreement on the plea and the sentence that the person is going to get, sometimes in a vacuum, in terms of characteristics of the person. So what I heard this morning was, I'm also going to say that I think for purposes of this decision, we are not putting any one interest front and center. We are weighing them and acknowledging that they are all important to the integrity of our outcomes and the integrity of our policy. So we certainly have the fear and concerns of individual victims and also communities, which our system stakeholders have to respond to. We have the realities of the incarcerated person and whatever opportunity they have or don't have to access programming in the Department of Corrections. We have the interests of their families, which are also coinciding with the interests of the communities in which they live. We know that families are, they do suffer a negative impact when a loved one is incarcerated. We have the very direct realities of the victims, and that brings up this question of healing versus punishment. We have a lot more information now than we did at the point in time when our victim services models were being developed about what really helps victims deal with trauma. And some of it is counterintuitive, and some of it is surprising. We also know that trauma is not limited to the victims of crime. It extends to law enforcement officers, correctional officers, the people who are in the system. I would say defense attorneys and prosecutors and judges. One of the judges on SPAC shared with us that when he was forced to impose a sentence divorced from reality, he just withdrew and kind of numbed himself. So, and we have the very real needs of the system. The system needs to resolve cases. We need to move these cases forward. We need to come to fair and just dispositions. And I would add one more, which is truly SPAC-centric. We do have a need for better knowledge and understanding through collecting the right data, not just the administrative data. And also, I want to be very clear, not burdening our stakeholders with collecting a bunch of little pieces of data that don't matter. And the way we get to that is hearing the research voice at the outset. And we should think about it in terms of the questions that we want to have answered. I don't think there is anybody on this task force who feels like the system is what we really want it and need it to be, because all of you have been involved in efforts to pass new policies to make it better. So those are what I heard. Those are the themes that I heard. And there's a lot of pain around the individuals who are become system involved. There's a lot of pain around resources and how they're spent. But I also would urge all of us to keep in mind, and it's hard right now because things are hard right now and fear is running high. But I think we need to keep in mind that Illinois has done some really groundbreaking things. We have, for the first time, put our money where our mouth is on investing in highly stressed, underserved communities through the JEO and the the R3 program. That is the first time in my 23 years in government that I have seen a direct link between readily available resources and addressing the needs. So I think that's important. We have an evidence-based education funding formula that, if it is fully funded, will address some of the educational inequities that we know contribute to unhealthy communities and to children not having the opportunities they need to progress. So when there are other things, I'm not going to waste your time going through them, but please keep also those things in mind, and the very frustrating reality that they take time. It takes time for results to show up in data. It takes time for good analysis to be done. So in those broad themes, and I'm sorry if you had a theme that I left out, let's get started in talking about how we as a task force want to, either we can talk about it in terms of defining some principles or some parameters around how we are going to keep in mind the interests of justice around this work. Susan, take it away.
Well, I would actually like to see if Yaakov Delaney would be willing to actually take up that question, because I think at this juncture, it would be useful to talk a little bit about healing, redemption, rehabilitation. Yaakov, is that something that you'd be willing to do at this juncture?
Sure. Thanks, Susan. I can talk briefly on a few things, and thank you all for this ripe conversation. I think I would like to start with how we infuse redemption and forgiveness into these conversations and into this work. Just me specifically, I approach this work with a unique lens. I'm a justice system impacted person, and that encompasses me not just being a formerly incarcerated person, but prior to that, I was a former child of an incarcerated parent. And so my exposure to the justice system began when I was around 6 years old. And as a young Black male growing up on the southwest side of Chicago, as Ari mentioned, in a disinvested neighborhood and community, during the same time war on drug policies were being implemented, I witnessed firsthand how my father returned home from serving in the Army with a heroin addiction, and instead of receiving treatment for complications of his disease, he was sentenced to a prison term, which left behind a wife who was my mother and 3 young children. And as a teenager, I witnessed how relatives, how a large portion of my community members who suffered drug-related issues got swept away into this system, leaving behind many children and many families. And during this same time, tough on crime punishment philosophy combined with war on drugs legislation brought longer sentences. And so as I developed into a teenager in the early 90s, I became a victim of gun violence. A year later, at the age of 19, I was involved in a violent offense that caused the death of another young Black male. And this is something that, sorry, as Joby hinted on earlier, I was a person who was subsequently sentenced under that felony murder rule, and which levied a 45-year prison term. And so this was prior to truth in sentencing legislation. And so just wanted to highlight some of that, because as we have some of these important discussions, I'd also suggest for us to keep in mind that the victim and the perpetrator of harm is often one and the same. And so as I entered into this system, at a young age. I obtained like a GED certificate, paralegal certificate, associate's degree, several vocational certifications. These were programs that were still accessible for a person that was in the system under a violent offense, which has changed since the time that I was in there. I think I heard Chief Davis mentioning like the programs and that needs to be accessible for folks who are serving long-term sentences. I worked as a law library clerk, which many people refer to as like jailhouse lawyers, for at least 14 years, and observed many of the men that I was incarcerated with being released, only to like return, some like within months after leaving. And so that like prompted me to have these conversations with guys I was interacting with. I developed like a series of questions because I wanted to, sorry, I wanted to learn like what was causing them to come back. And it was through these conversations that I discovered like this common thread.
Yakov Delaney is speaking right now.
I'm sorry, Yakov?
Oh, did I go out? And I'm having internet problems. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Did I go out?
You did for just a second.
Okay.
But please go ahead.
Yes, I am having major internet problems today. Sorry about that. I am in and out. I don't know where I went out yet, Ed, but I was kind of backtracked to, I was talking about like just having conversations with some of the men that I was incarcerated with, and just trying to figure out what was some of the significant factors that was causing these men to return back to prison. And what I learned was like, there was multiple issues, but it was often two common threads, and it was shelter and employment. They were having difficulties with either getting housing or getting employment, or a combination of both, due to their criminal records that they had just served time for. And as we know, shelter and employment, these are like two basic needs of success for adults to become successful and productive in our society. And so I just started pondering the question, and just, I would also like to just put that question out to the group, to the task force as well. It's like, what does that say about the community and the society that our people are returning to? If a person who commits a criminal offense is sentenced to a prison term as the penalty to pay for his or her debt to society, why does our society like continue to be so unforgiving after that debt is paid? Even after extensive prison terms, many men and women like continue to face insurmountable barriers. Statistics have shown us, and I know someone mentioned it earlier, how long prison terms have not substantially reduced crime. And I heard earlier from Mark about the current population of IDOC. I think it's approximately 27,000, maybe a little over. And during my time in prison, there were like no programs that helped me to understand how systemic trauma had impacted my life and played a part in me eventually inflicting harm on someone else. It's that cycle. And that's some of the work that our JO initiative is starting to delve into in partnership with the Illinois Department of Corrections. And we also heard Mark talk about truth in sentencing and how that legislation was passed in 1998 and how it impacted the length of time that people served in prison for most serious violent offenses. But I also want to lift up the fact of how truth in sentencing also like removed the ability for individuals to earn time off of their sentences, as well as restricted those individuals from participating like in certain rehabilitative programs just based on the length of their sentences. And I'll try to wrap it up quick. So like prior to my release, I knew that I would have to like navigate these similar barriers. But I also knew that I wanted to advocate to remove barriers for people who were enduring or experiencing long-term sentences, and really for individuals who just had criminal records. That led me to do like work out in Cincinnati, Ohio as a paralegal advocate, but I gained that employment through an opportunity to volunteer in that organization that eventually hired me. But it was like this opportunity that gave me a second chance. It was allowed me the opportunity to be confident in my skill set, allowed me the opportunity like to contribute to my community and to society, just as the same as my role now, where I am in a capacity of working for the Lieutenant Governor of the state, who doesn't just talk about restorative justice and second chances, but has actually like put her words and passion for this work into action, whereby I can be a living example of why it's important for us to infuse redemption and forgiveness into our work, because there are countless other women and men who will be released from prison. There are many who, if given the opportunity and support system, will flourish, will thrive, will be significant contributors to their communities and to our societies. And I see there's something in the chat. Oh, sorry. I see, Kathy, you want me to talk a little bit about our restorative justice program. So a part of our JEO initiative, we are working on a restorative justice pilot in partnership with Prisoner Review Board, with Illinois Department of Corrections, with Cook County State's Attorney Victim Services Unit, Attorney General's Office Victim Services Unit, to create this restorative justice program that it has like two components. One component of it where a crime survivor, quote unquote victim, could be allowed the access to initiate a process whereby he or she can be in a facilitated discussion with the person that has inflicted harm upon him or her. This program in other states already has been implemented. It's called a victim offender dialogue. Just me being a restorative justice practitioner, I try not to even use harmful languages, and just knowing that even describing people as victim can be harmful in itself. And so we intentionally have described our naming our program as a restorative conferences. And then there's a second component of it, which is an apology letter bank, which will allow a person that's incarcerated to be in these healing spaces, workshops, and whereby they can draft up apology letters to a person that they have inflicted harm upon. And these letters will be sent to what we're developing out into what's called an apology letter bank. And once a letter is sent there, the person that's writing the letter will have no contact with the crime survivor. The victim services agencies that are partnering in this program will initially contact the crime survivor, let he or she know that a letter has been drafted, a letter is stored in this bank, and it's only upon the consent of the crime survivor will they be allowed to receive that letter. And so I know I may have went over my time, but I want to just wrap it up and just ask this question out. How do we want, knowing that I think it's 95% of our people serving time in our prison system will be released one day. Like, how do we want them to return to our communities?
Right. Yaakov, I'd like to do a couple things. One is I'd like to turn to Joby, who raised her hand and then disappeared, and now it's back again, to weigh in on this question. I really appreciate your perspective and hope that you will put the restorative justice programming that you mentioned in the chat so that others can see what that phenomenal program looks like. That's the first thing. And then the second thing.
Sorry if I'm going in and out as well.
Okay, it's all right. And then the other thing I'd love to do is actually ask Latoya if she would speak to language here, because I think as we go forward on all of these topics, it's going to be important to recognize, I think you said, Yakov, survivors or victims. It might be useful for us to have a discussion about what's the language that makes the most sense for this kind of work. But Joby, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a quick, first of all, thank you, Yakov, for your the knowledge that you just dropped. It's really helpful and useful in this context. And I think a couple of things I just want to lift up. One is the idea of people aren't just one thing. So a lot of people are many things. Some people are both victims of violence and have been on the other side of the gun. We have people whose children are split, people in our network who have some children in prison and who've lost children to gun violence. So I do think that that's also kind of what Ari was speaking about a little bit earlier, is how can we kind of break through the idea of looking at exceptions and look at examples that are more in line with the majority of the offenses. I think Susan was saying that earlier, the majority of experience. And I'm really looking forward to sort of charting some new ground on this together as a task force. I do want to mention one thing about programming, and it just makes me a little nervous when we start talking about programming in the context of release decisions. And the reason it makes me a little bit nervous is because our colleagues at the Illinois Department of Corrections, and maybe LaToya, you can speak to this too, are quite frankly under-resourced. As someone said earlier, we still, even though the prison population has gone down, we still have far more people in prison than what we spend on prison can support. And that doesn't mean we should be spending a lot more on prison. I'm not suggesting that. But what I am suggesting is that in my experience, in our experience at Restore Justice, half of my staff, 50% of my staff has been deeply impacted by the justice system. 4 of the people on my staff have done long prison terms, 3 of those over 25 years. None of the 3 of them were in facilities where programming was made available to them. And I was able to hire and pretty quickly train all 3 of them to be incredibly effective nonprofit staff within the course of a year. So I want to sort of just suggest that while programming is critical, it is not the only way people rehabilitate in prison, that there are as many horror stories as you can tell about situations in prison being desperate and dire. There are networks of people in prison who help each other learn, who share resources, books, who coach one another and mentor one another. And while certainly it would be ideal to have programming in every prison, and I will always support more programming in prison, obviously. As a gatekeeping factor for release, I want to just be careful that we don't forget that many people do simply grow, even in the worst of circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you. LaToya, I'd like to go to you, and then I'd like to turn to the chief and say, as a gatekeeper to the system, I'd really like to understand how restorative justice fits into your paradigm of policing. So LaToya and then Chief Davis.
Yes, thank you. So the conversation about language, I think, is really a very important one. And so at the Department of Corrections, one of our initiatives was to explore the use of humanizing language when referring to the individuals in custody, being mindful of pronoun usage as well. And so as a result of that, the Department of Corrections determined that we would no longer utilize the term offender to refer to the individuals in custody, instead asking staff to refer to the members of the incarcerated population as individuals in custody. We thought that this change in language would also extend to our written materials and communications as they become updated. But it was really important that this change of language took place because we do understand that words matter. We also understand that referring to an individual as an offender or an inmate suggests that their crimes alone define who they are. And we understand that that is not the sum and substance of who they are. Also that, the individuals in our custody are much more than the crimes that they've committed. I think many of you have kind of talked about that already, right? Their mothers, fathers, sons, daughters. Many of these individuals are our future or current artists, poets, scholars, musicians. They are just within the Illinois Department of Corrections at this moment. And as Yakov so eloquently stated, they will indeed be our neighbors one day. So it is really important for us to kind of start that process, at least by the way that we refer to people. And so that's one thing that we've done within the Illinois Department of Corrections to kind of start that process. As all of you know, things take time, as many of you have said, but that's one effort that we're making to utilize more appropriate use of language when we're referring to individuals in our custody. Also, I know one of you mentioned programming, and Joby, thank you for that. Programming within the Illinois Department of Corrections is, it's a matter of resources, right? And all of us would love every person within the Illinois Department of Corrections to have access to any program that they want to participate in. And so conversations about that, obviously, we're open to. But as Joby indicated, as is everything else, generally a matter of resources.
Thank you. Chief, how does restorative justice fit into your world?
So, great question. And I think I need to kind of preface my answer with a couple things. Those of you who on this meeting who already know me kind of understand this, but for those who don't, need to kind of set the stage. So and I said it before, my perspective is not what you might traditionally hear from a law enforcement person. Yes, I am the president of the Illinois Association of Chiefs of Police, but I'm the first Black president in the 80-year history of the organization. And I share with my colleagues and others that my perspective is not just that of a law enforcement person. My perspective is that of a 59-year-old Black man that has had encounters with law enforcement and with, my family. I heard somebody talk about it before, as Black folks, and I talk about this often, in that just by default, we deal with things that other communities don't deal with. For the most part, if you're a Black person and you're from the Chicagoland area, I got family members that are heroin addicts, that have been crack addicts, that have gone to jail. They're my family, but that's not something we hear about. That's something that we live, because it's often part of our culture. And with that perspective, I bring I look through a different lens than a lot of my colleagues. They look through that law enforcement, rule of law, that we're going to enforce the law, while in fact, absolutely, we need to make sure we keep our communities safe. I mention it all the time as far as being equitable in what we do and doing it for the right reasons and doing it properly is kind of the lens that I look through. So from a restorative standpoint, somebody mentioned it earlier, that most folks are going to end up back in our communities. And so with that in mind, we need to, if we're trying to do it, depends on what our reasonings are. If we're just trying to punish people, then we're going to put them away, we're going to warehouse them as long as we possibly can. We're going to warehouse them and they get out when they get out. So if that's the mindset that you have, then that's how we get where we are right now. But if we're trying to truly help all communities, then we have to take a different perspective. And that perspective that I look at is that even we talk about empathy. I share empathy when I talk to, I travel around the country, talk about bias in policing and things that we need to change. And the fundamental thing that I share is that of empathy. And with empathy, I don't care where you've come from. If you got a heart and a head for empathy, even if you haven't really utilized it, we can, if you got a heart and a head for empathy, I don't care where you come from, I can put you in any environment. And if you're being empathetic to those folks that you're dealing with, you can deal with them in an equitable manner. And so that's where the restorative justice for me in the process comes into play. As a leader, it's my responsibility that even though I may have members of my police department that don't think like I do, it's my responsibility as chief to understand that while you're here in my police department and we're dealing with the people of Hazel Crest, this is how we're going to deal with them. And I need to set that tone. And as a leader of the Illinois Chiefs Association, that's what I say. I say that, is every chief going to be in line with me? Absolutely not. But as leader, sitting in the big chair for the next couple of months, at least for these next couple of months, those are the things that I put out there. And those are the things that I believe, once again, not just as a law enforcement person, but as a Black man, due to my personal experiences that I've had and that family members of mine have had and still continue to have. And so, that's why it kind of sits a little differently with me. But I also understand that you don't have to be a Black man to understand that. Once again, if you've got that heart and head for empathy, people can share their experiences with you and you can try to understand that. But there are those, and I'm real about this as well, who don't want to hear that, especially in my profession. There are folks who like the status quo. Our job is to lock them up and keep them away from the community. And I get that. And so that's why it's so important that groups like this and task forces like this come along and we are able to help bring forth ideas that are going to be good for everybody.
Reactions from anyone?
Do head nods and gratitude count?
I know, that's what I was going to say. I'm so grateful for the perspectives we just heard from the chief and from Yakov. Just thank you so much for sharing that. I don't even know how to add to that. The only thing I will add in terms of redemption is the work I've gotten to do, kind of similar to what Joby's mentioned, is with young people. I joke around with my law students that I represent folks who are 14 and 45. That's not really a stretch. But the benefit of that is I do get to see that spectrum of growth and change and rehabilitation. Some young people are there quickly. We've represented young people who, in the aftermath of something terrible happening. And by the way, I was hearing Yakov's story about those cycles of violence, and that is absolutely representative of the population that I've worked with, where they have been oftentimes the victims of trauma and violence and abuse and substance abuse in a variety of situations. And now that has perpetuated itself into a cycle of them causing harm. And sometimes that young person can get to a moment of remorse and reflection and growth, quickly. And sometimes it takes some time. And, and then I see that, sometimes it's far before they turn 45, but, this moment, oftentimes where they've spent some time incarcerated, and sometimes despite that incarcerated setting, have actually grown and found this path where they are just desperate to account for their actions, to really be able to confront their role in whatever harm they have caused, and even to reach out to the family or individuals they've harmed. And so I was really appreciating that, what Yakov mentioned about this opportunity to write letters that may not be delivered, but that could be kept to address that harm, to talk about the harm they've caused. And so I just want to say that I really think that any process we revisit in terms of or visit here in terms of rehabilitation, growth, and remorse, we need to offer these opportunities for folks to come forward with that, to reach that goal in this process. And I've also seen how that can impact a family that's harmed, or an individual that's been harmed too, where that growth process is meaningful to them, where they might have been waiting for an answer from this individual. Like, why did you do this? Why did this happen? Like, how did you come to that moment? And our system does not really allow for that. But I think right sizing our sentencing system and allowing for these opportunities and pathways for resentencing and earned release over time can offer that opportunity. So I'm just really grateful to hear from the folks on this task force about that.
I guess your comments make me think about what we know and what we don't know. And in this process, particularly because we want to be able to generalize to the larger prison population, I think it's going to be important to ground this in current knowledge and research, but also to recognize that language does matter and that people reasonably hold contrary perspectives. And so, one of the things I'd love to ask Bob Berlin, so I'm going to, is does a belief that people can change play into your discussions with individuals in the community? How does it play into community fear about the release of prisoners or of people who are coming out of custody?
Oh, I mean, I think everyone believes people can change. And I think in my discussions with people in the community and my experience, most of the community understands that. But there's also on the other side, and I'm not talking about every case, every one of these 27,000 plus people in the Department of Corrections. But there are some who I know the community believe should never get out because of what they've done. Not all of them. And obviously every case is different. That's again, going back to why I think it's so important that we have the data and the facts in each person's involvement in all these cases, because they are all so different.
Well, our next meeting is going to take up a discussion of eligibility. And between now and that next discussion, it would be helpful to us to have your thoughts and everyone's thoughts about what data questions should be answered, if they can be answered, that would help inform a rich discussion about eligibility. I'm hearing you say some crimes, some perpetrators create more fear than others. And so, trying to figure out how might we get data to drive a conversation about that. And I appreciate being corrected to returning citizen. Thank you.
Sure.
Other comments?
I guess just really, really briefly, and obviously we're going to be talking about this next week or at the next meeting in terms of eligibility. That I think data will provide us some very helpful big picture or 10,000 foot conversation about sort of thinking about these problems. But I think on the eligibility side, that's where I think it's important to not ignore the individual circumstances, as I think, again, as what State Attorney Berlin was talking about, that there are individuals within each of these categories that a judge, anyone looking at the case would find this is not someone eligible for release or not someone who should be released. But if that can only happen after an individualized consideration, that can only happen after looking at that one case and not categorically sort of limiting a pool from the conversation. So I think that's a thing that I'm excited that we'll be delving into at the next meeting. But I think that the data will only get us so far, because I think at the end of the day, the question of release will always be something that rises and falls based on individual consideration.
One of the questions I have, which is holding me back here, is that kind of data available about the individual circumstances of an individual person in custody's experience? I don't know. Is it readily available? Is that the kind of thing that one can?
Kathy's shaking her head. I'll jump in and just, my answer as somebody who is, so my first 15 years of my career I spent in the public education field. And I worked for school CEO, Chief Arnie Duncan, when No Child Left Behind was passed. And No Child Left Behind demanded an extraordinary amount of data be made public very, very quickly. And I got a firsthand look at what data is collected in a large public system, what's collected, how accurately, and how quickly it can be analyzed. And in the school system, the Chicago Public Schools, which at the time had more than 500 schools and over 500,000 students, a far vaster community than when we're talking about in Illinois prisons, we collected most of the data that was necessary, but the system did not have the ability to coalesce it. And this was one system that had a basic shared idea of what data needed to be collected. Illinois has 102 counties that each have their own elected state's attorney. They have their own systems. They have their own ideas and standards and values around how data is collected. And I think Kathy would agree that while some data is centralized and easier to access, the kind of nuance we're looking at would require a much deeper dive, and it would in fact require perhaps sampling, looking at types of cases specifically. And again, I'm not an expert here, but I will say that just as somebody who's spent the past 12, 13 years trying to crack this nut as an outsider, it would cost more than an interested organization could come up with. And I think I'd love to hear what Kathy has to say about this, because one of the, quite frankly, if we could get agreement on only one or two things in this group between now and July, if we could come to an agreement about how we might level set and change the baseline of what data is collected and evaluated and shared across 102 counties, that would be a huge victory.
Kathy?
Yeah, I think the thing to understand about the data that is accessible, and Mark, please jump in and fill in any gaps that I'm leaving out, is the data that we have is the data that's collected for administrative purposes. And it comes largely from law enforcement and the court system and the Department of Corrections. We don't have any requirement to report into the criminal history system what I'll call mitigating factors, such as a person's educational attainment, marital relationships, all the things that we know support pro-social development. And in most cases, there's not a lot of that evidence presented. Not all, and it kind of depends on the case and the resources of the defense counsel. So what we do have is what I'll call the 800-pound gorilla. We have criminal history, and criminal history drives sentencing more than any other thing, other than the crime of conviction. So one of the things that we, the way that we can describe individuals is through those types of parameters. So, how many times they were arrested or convicted, were they convicted of misdemeanors or felonies, were they sentenced to probation or to prison? It doesn't tell us the very important things like, they were the getaway car driver, not the shooter. They had a, strong family structure and went to church every Sunday. Their social network, we couldn't even really tell you exactly where they were living, which is, hugely important when looking at high volume neighborhoods. So where we would find that information, if there's anywhere at all, is in the files of defense counsel. And I'm pretty sure that the Cook County PD's office doesn't have a data system that could collect that. We might be able to find some of it in the briefs filed by the appellate defender's office, where they would talk about mitigating evidence if there's a sentencing issue in a very serious case. So what we're talking about, and I totally agree with Joby, is recalibrating the data collection system to accommodate some research-oriented materials. Or another option would be, data sharing and being able to match data so we can put together from administrative data a good picture of the individual. And we just don't do that in the state of Illinois. So no, we can't get into individual characteristics that we should be able to talk about when we're talking about long-term sentencing. The Department of Corrections, they can tell us the person's been in for 25 years and never got a single disciplinary ticket. They've mentored other inmates, or they volunteered to take care of, an older inmate with dementia. They can probably have some notes about that in their records. So Mark, am I leaving out anything?
No, I think that's actually most of it. One other thing though, I agree. It's basically, if you really want to get to this, you'll have to look at basically paper files for the most part. One other thing though with the criminal history data is that because probably the efforts will be focusing on people who've served such a long time in prison, their criminal history data that we have access to, that administrative data in the electronic records, may not be very good because they would have had most of their arrests 20, 30 years ago where electronic fingerprinting was not done. So back then, the cryo records are not as great because it's basically, you have to look at the ink and roll records to get kind of criminal history. And then dispositions have to basically attach to those. It's just basically the quality of the criminal history really increased after about 2001 when LiveScan was adopted statewide. So even the administrative data on the criminal history is not going to be great. I think the Department of Corrections prior incarcerations will be very good at least, but we're not going to know stuff like Yakov's background experience. That's just not going to show up in electronic records that we have access to, or pretty much anybody has access to. It's going to be in paper case files and that type of thing.
Thank you. One of the things that would be helpful, I think, it would be to actually understand the constraints that the data and the systems impose as we think about the question of eligibility. It does leave open the opportunity to think about eligibility in terms of age, in terms of conviction, crime of conviction, how old someone is, how long they've served. So between now and the next meeting, if people could give some thought to what else might we be able to identify that could cut across the population, but also be reasonably accessible in terms of knowing what we're talking about. I don't know if I made that clear or not. Do you know what I'm trying to say? What are the general characteristics, since we can't know the individual case? What are the sort of general themes or general population characteristics might be useful?
Right, we're not going to get perfect data. I think, and Kathy is right. If we could kind of set the table going forward, that would make any similar discussions in future years a lot easier. It's not going to help us right now, perhaps as much as we would like. But one thing I would like to suggest is that eligibility itself. For example, in the current state's attorney statute, I believe when a state's attorney wants to bring a case forward, and Ari, you can correct me, eligibility isn't based on any specific criteria about the case. It's up at the discretion of the state's attorney to bring a case forward. So as we go through this process, we need to remember that we are building something hopefully building something relatively new, and that eligibility doesn't necessarily have to be determined as at the front gate. It could be determined somewhere else in the process. So we don't have to get stuck in that particular question if, for example, the data we have today isn't good enough to make a really sound decision. A good example of that right now is unfortunately really overwhelmed clemency process, is that anybody can submit a clemency, whether or not it's accepted or whether or not it's successful is up to the governor. But the gate is open at the front end.
So what I'm hearing, let me make sure I understand, is that it would be worthwhile to simply have a discussion about eligibility and how one would define it and who gets to define it, and to not necessarily consider it a fixed point at the entry, at the start of the process. Perhaps eligibility is something that evolves over the course of, a motion. Is that right? Am I getting this down?
I think you are.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to add to Joby's point, I think a little bit, which is maybe what you were asking, Susan. Like, I think that one thing when we're thinking about eligibility is sort of what we mean, like what do we even mean by that? And where in this process, where in a person's process through our system are we talking about, right? And so, I think that that's something for us to just consider in terms of like, those entry points when they enter the system may not always be the best determination of whether or not they're, eligible. But like if we I think Scott had mentioned something about individualized consideration. I think there's going to be a question of whether we're talking about eligibility to begin this process, eligibility to engage in it, at multiple points in time. And then the ultimate question would be eligibility to be resentenced or released or whatever that ultimate question is. So I think we're talking about eligibility maybe in a couple different frames, and that might be part of that conversation when we get to it.
Thank you. And, it makes me want to go back to an earlier question I think I put to you, which is how do we, is the current state of knowledge or research about general populations, how do we bring that into the mix in this fluid notion of eligibility? You've mentioned 14 to 45, I think it is, that you work with people from 14 to 45. Well, someone who, gets into some bad behavior at 14 is not the same as after they've spent 20 years in prison, correct?
Right. In my experience, yeah.
Yeah. And so, age at the time of the crime might actually be one consideration, but how do we think about that over the course of a person's involvement in the system? So how do we people have access to information about the latest research on changes over time or the impact of different kinds of programming. I think just helping us identify some of those to pull together between now and the next meeting would be very helpful.
Yeah, and I think there is some data out there, right? There's data on, adolescent development and growth up through, emerging adults. There's data and information about recidivism over time, so we have some data points, but of course that's not individualized. It's aggregated, and so it can be used as, I think, an approximate measure of ideas for us to think about in terms of different possible decision points, but it's not, I don't think, going to be a substitute for us really thinking about, wanting to provide multiple opportunities to examine that in the growth of someone's, lifetime in prison in these cases.
Yeah, I agree. I just think that it will help set a context.
I just want to jump in with the question, right? The question that and the framing that Kathy started with was kind of all the various interests, right? She laid out the rehabilitation of the person who's incarcerated, the community, their family, the victim's family, the system's need, or the system's job to move people through the system. But like, how does this weighing happen? How do people think about how you weigh it? Let's say you have the data. Is that an impossible question or a bad question?
I don't think it's either impossible or bad. I sorry, my camera, I think people are thinking about it, because that's actually the question, right? So, if we look at, it's got to be a scale that has multiple arms, and it has a community safety arm. Obviously, it has a consideration of people who consider themselves survivors or victims. It has an arm for people who consider themselves, in need or wanting their community to be whole, and or perhaps a family that needs a loved one back home earning and paying bills again. It might have an arm. It obviously has an arm for a community standard around punishment, which we're not going to ignore. It might have an arm for rehabilitation and the ability of someone, again, in a remarkable circumstances, to grow and change. So those are 5 or 6 things that we need to weigh. And I don't know that there's a magic formula that everyone in this group would agree on. But I think if we can agree at least on what needs to be weighed,
right,
that would be a very, very positive start.
So do you want to start and throw the first pitch?
I just did. I could say them again. Let's see if I can
say them again.
All right. So we've got community safety. That's obviously probably the primary purpose of our justice system, right? Is to keep people safe, and especially when we're talking about violence, and people want to feel safe. 2, we've got the interests of people who consider themselves victims, survivors, or people who have an interest in the outcome of a specific case from the perspective of a participant in that exact event. We have people who would consider themselves community members of people who might be incarcerated, and whether or not they have a want or a need for the restorative justice side of things, or from an economic point of view, to have family members home and earning rather than in prison and costing. We have a whole area around punishment and community standards around punishment and appropriate punishment for certain crimes. Did I miss one that I said first? I can't remember, but that's where I would start.
I think you missed the rehabilitation.
I missed rehabilitation. I missed the most important one. Okay. So then of course, obviously, rehabilitation, and I see a number of people who've joined our meeting from organizations that have been working on this issue longer than I have. And so I'm going to give a shout out to the Illinois Constitution, 111, I believe it is, that we have a value in the state toward restoring people to useful citizenship.
So what do people think about the 5? Community safety, interest of people who are victims or survivors, community members of the incarcerated, community standards of punishment, and rehabilitation. That those are the 5 factors that we weigh.
I would say I like that as a starting point.
Other reactions?
Are there like 2 competing interests that get the most weight? Are they all equal?
Historically speaking, seriousness of the offense usually gets the most weight in any of these conversations. And I think that we're trying to think differently about that. And Joby had stolen my answer earlier that, I think, all this can be framed around our Illinois constitutional standard of proportionality, which again sort of talks about the seriousness of the offense, but that all penalties, and so the conversations we're having now are conversations about the idea of how do we restore someone to useful citizenship. And so I think it's there's a litany of case law out there that always, like the phrase that pays is the totality of the circumstances that a court is going to consider, or a judge or a sentencing authority. But seriously, the defense is one that usually is given greater weight in that conversation.
It's kind of trying to understand, right? So Joby laid out 5 kind of interests of justice or factors. Are you adding a 6th, or is community safety a seriousness of the offense, or is it something totally outside the factors that you weigh?
I mean, I think that I really did appreciate how Joby was sort of setting the table for this, and I would tend to agree with that. I was just speaking sort of historically about sort of how we set up a system of punishment that is that has ideas of retribution and just sort of like the straight the idea of like of straight punishment for punishment's sake is one of the factors that goes into the conversation, as well as rehabilitation, as well as the idea of sort of the broader impact. But I just was flagging from how we arrived at where we are now. I think is historically grounded in I'm blanking on its deterrence and retribution and rehabilitation. I think are sort of the primary pillars that go into a punishment system.
So for example, if we're looking at the punishment system, bringing in knowledge and research about the deterrent effect and whether it actually exists in the way that we think it might exist, might be something to bring into the discussion. So, to use your language, Joby, of arms, seems like every one of these arms is a slinky arm. It's got the obvious, and then it's got the shadow side. So it seems like we're going to need to flesh out each of those notions as we go through this process.
I think that's right. And when you say the shadow side, I mean, I think maybe to be sort of collaborative in this group, that we have stakeholders from different parts of the system who will see each of these arms in different lights. So the extent to which, a next step between now and our next meeting is gathering as much data and as much research as we can about each arm so that we can have a common starting point from which to weigh these things, I think is going to be very useful. So as first meetings go, if we could charge the team with really contributing to that. So if every task force member really thought through what do they rely on when they think about what's an appropriate punishment? What do they rely on when they think about what's an appropriate mode of engagement for folks who are considered victims by the system? That kind of collaboration of sharing of our resources might help us come to understand where we might have some areas of agreement and where we might need to focus our more debate-centered stuff if that comes up.
Well, maybe that's something that the team can support by doing some work in between the meeting, put together, for example, a set of questions that we ask people to think about and weigh in on, and then do a quick and dirty analysis of what's the range of perspective here and what are the sort of high points that come up in the course of answering a question about a system of punishment or answering a set of questions about the community impact or the family impact. So it's something that the team can give some thought to how we support the group in having that kind of rich discussion.
I'm just curious, we haven't heard from Representative Kelly in a while. Kind of what are your reactions to the factors that we would weigh, or the factors that are weighed?
Sorry, that cocktail party thing just kicked in and I heard my name, but I was on a call, so I apologize. Maybe Senator Peters can weigh in.
I literally was texting to get lunch right now real quick, so I apologize. I am so sorry about that.
Well, no worries. Let me just recap where we were. The question on the table was kind of, what are the things, the interests that we weigh? Kind of the question on the table is, what are these competing interests and how do we weigh them? And so we put kind of 5 interests on the table that should be weighed: community safety, interests of people who are the victims, survivors, or have a vested interest in the outcome of the case, community members of the incarcerated, the community standards of punishment and rehabilitation. And I guess when you think about what are the interests that we weigh, do these seem like the right interests to you? That's the question on the table.
I mean, I'll say that these are often subjective terms around these things, and so what we're doing is applying something rather subjective to something and trying to make it purely objective. I think at the end of the day, what I would feel this task force about is that we have a lot of people who are incarcerated. We still have many areas that don't actually have safety, even though we've increased a lot of people who are incarcerated. There's a clear gap between that and the intent made to do so. And so I would say that we would want to see how all these things, all these bullet points are kind of showing that they're all interlocked with each other at the same time. So I think that if we don't actually notice that these things are actually intersecting or crossing at the same points with each other, and therefore creating a reproducing the same issues over and over again, and not actually solving what I believe the prison system was supposedly intended to do, then that's the problem. And I think that's why we should kind of hit at that, and why we need to have some changes when it comes to our look at sentencing. That's my view, because they're not silos, right? So people who go, if we look at it, people who get incarcerated are often people who are we've already heard this, right? Survivors of some sort of pain or trauma, and they keep reproducing each other. So why would we want to invest in that? So I think we need to answer some of those questions and then take those steps necessary to say, what are we going to do to start moving away from that? And how can we create a process to move away from that? So fundamentally, we just need to hit at something both slightly deeper and get more involvement from people, and to even get us to move away from our standard notions of safety and trauma and care. So that's me done ranting, and I will turn over to webcasting.
I don't know that I can add much to that. I think for me, most particularly his description of these standards as kind of subjective and is the piece that jumps out. I don't know that there is a way to have a one size fits all approach to this. You have to check 4 of these 5 boxes or something. I just don't know that's going to make sense. Again, back to Robert's point about the how these things all interplay. So I don't know if these are helpful responses, but it's my immediate reaction.
Well, the other piece for me, as someone listening to this conversation for the first time and considering what's being said, it does seem to me that there are multiple constituencies represented in this task force group to begin with. And it seems to me that each one of these arms or characteristics or factors to be weighed, that there's a tension depending on where you sit on how you might think about these, and which is behind wanting to gather some more information in between, but also inviting people to weigh in with perhaps their perspective or the most dramatic or exaggerated form of what their constituency might say, to have a better feel for what are the tensions that underlie this work and underlie any effort to try and apply these characteristics to a resentencing set of recommendations. In other words, does an elected official feel differently from a chief of police, from a public defender, from a state's attorney? You know, that all of those, there's got to be a tension.
Yeah, forgive me. That, I mean, honestly, like we all live in this tension every day. So if we're not stating the obvious, it's because it's
so obvious.
It's the water we all swim in, and it's the air we all breathe. And I think if we need to be stating it, I think obviously the politics of punishment are, you know, it's a whole other, we could write a book on it, but I'm not sure it's going to be helpful right now to delve into that. So I would sort of focus on, again, it's kind of setting us up for our upcoming conversations by bringing, again, as much detail and as much nuance in the research and in the kinds of data that we're going to be able to use to drive the conversation. And I'd love it if someone else would chime in about this, but if it bears saying, you know, there are people on this task force who get elected every couple of years, and a major part of most challenge campaigns is someone's record on crime. And that's something that, of course, has police and law enforcement see things that I will never see. They are a part of these sort of terrible, tragic situations. They see people on the worst days of their lives. Those of us who work with people who had their incident a long time ago, we see people 30 or 40 years later. We see their families, we see the devastation. So we all do have different perspectives. Of course we do. How we tease those out, again, I think is perhaps a later stage in the process. That's my opinion, and I would love to hear from others. Bob's got his hand up. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, so I mean, you raise a great point in regards to those of us on the task force that are elected. And yeah, it's a consideration. But let me just say this personally, and I think a lot of the state's attorneys feel the same way. It's not about being necessarily tough on crime, it's being smart on crime. And a lot of us have been able to convince our constituents about programs like diversion and drug court and mental health court, which are incredibly successful. And, you know, some of those programs, when they first started, the community, there was a lot of hesitancy there. People were concerned. Are we being too soft? But then when you show them that, hey, these programs actually work, we're doing great things, people buy into it. So, yes, to the point, there's, of course, as you said, Joby, we live in it every day. But I think, you know, the people on this task force are on here for a reason.
Right.
You know, we were selected, I think, because we have open minds, we're reasonable. And it's a great discussion we're having, and I think we're getting to the heart of a lot of these matters. But I think, really, not just speaking for myself, but a lot of states' attorneys, it's smart on crime, and that's it. In some cases, yes, it is. That does mean that you're very tough, but not in all cases. So there is, you know, there is no one size fits all.
Thank you. Other comments?
I think the point that State's Attorney Berlin just raised, like, flags something for me, which is I think that proof point is important, right? Like that people do get convinced when they see good results out of programming and other things, right? And so I was just recalling, I know Philadelphia has this research from their study of juvenile lifers. I think there may be others out there of the recidivism rates being extremely low, for instance, for that population, for folks who have, you know, served a long time. And so I think that kind of data might be helpful to look into, I'm happy to do some digging on that too. I think there's some research out there on that.
I'd love to hear from Representative Spain and Senator Bailey.
Hey, I'm here. I'm going to have to forego the video. I apologize. I had to get in my vehicle and travel a short distance. One thing that comes to mind, maybe you're aware of this, and maybe you're not. Sheriff Mendricks in DuPage County has an amazing program in his jail. Basically, it's kind of a vocational program where people have a come in and are taught trades, and essentially when they leave the jail, they're given 3 suits or 2 suits, whatever it is, clothing, and they have a job waiting for them. So I don't know if anyone here has that on their radar or not. As we go through this, obviously one of the big concerns, and I know we've talked about this, is the crime involved. If it's a crime of person, obviously a rape or murder, obviously that sticks out, that we have to be careful about that. But anyway, I did want to just mention the situation with the Sheriff Mendricks, that you might want to get him involved and hear some of his ideas so that we can help people, be function in society. And then as well as that, potentially give businesses a reason to hire. I don't know what that would be, financial or whatever, but that is a big problem that these people have. It's literally impossible to get a job when they get out. So anyway, that's my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Spain, are you still with us?
Perhaps not.
Okay.
Can I add one other consideration? And I really want to bring us back to understanding the purposes of this meeting, of this task force. And I think one of the things that we should consider, and it's the intersection of research and experience and all of the other things, is the responsibility or the need, or however we're going to frame it, for a policy to actually have some hope of working. And so I don't think we need to get into a lot of granular analysis. We can do a recidivism rate calculation very easily. I also want to caution against relying on national studies or meta-analyses, because we're not looking for a national response. We are looking at our population and our experiences, which we can do that, and are happy to talk about how we want to do that with anybody who wants to be part of that discussion. But we are in a very unique historical spot right now. We have a prison population that is lower than any of us could have ever imagined. And we need to think about, as going forward, how do we want the system to look 5 or 10 years from now? And what role does a policy around early release, which there is no dispute research-wise or cost-benefit analysis-wise that having avenues of early release incentivizes good behavior in the prison system. So I would add that as another arm to consider, really being mindful of using the resources that we have well in figuring out how we're going to do this, or what we're going to recommend. We don't have to figure out how we're going to do this. We have to figure out what this group of experts recommends for crafting the how we're going to do this, if it gets to that point in the next session or the session after, however that's going to work.
Thank you, Kathy, for that clarification and reminder. I think we're at about the point to segue into public comment. Are there individual?
This is Darren Bailey. I apologize. I've been jumping off, but my assistant Colin Mosley is going to take my place. If that's okay, I do apologize, and I look forward to the next meeting.
Thank you, Senator.
Kathy,
Am
I right that Mike is going to facilitate the public comment if anybody?
Well, I'm not seeing any hands up for the public comment. So if you are a member of the public and would like to make a comment, please raise your hand. And there we have Alexandra Block. Go ahead, Alexandra.
Good afternoon, everyone.
And I will just remind everybody that we'd like you to keep your comments to 3 minutes, and they must be focused on the subject matter of the meeting. So take it away, Alexandra.
Thank you. I am an attorney in Chicago. I work at Miller, Shackman, Levine, and Feldman, and I'm also one of the co-chairs of the Criminal Justice Advisory Committee for Chicago Appleseed and the Chicago Council of Lawyers. I just wanted to bring the task force's attention to a set of guiding principles that Chicago Appleseed, Chicago Council of Lawyers, and a number of other advocacy organizations have put together in an open letter to the task force. I put a link to that in the chat, and would encourage everyone in the task force to please look at it. The animating purpose of us coming up with these principles was to not to make a specific suggestion for exactly what a system of early release in Illinois should look like, but to encourage the task force to consider many possible pathways, and to encourage you to look at this as a systemic and administrative issue, not to get caught up in the theoretical purposes, but to just say there are many possible ways that Illinois could accomplish its goals of re-examining the cases of people who have been serving extremely long sentences. I wanted to emphasize something I think that Joby mentioned several times, and that is the focus is different pathways for individuals to get individualized reconsideration of their sentences. So not categorizing people in, based on a crime of conviction or any other exclusionary categories, but thinking of a number of different ways that people could apply through the courts, through PRB, through state's attorneys, through any IDOC created administrative processes for earning early release. There are a number of pathways that could be implemented, and to encourage the task force to look at all of those possible pathways. So I think I only had 3 minutes. I will stop there, and I really appreciate the task force considering the work of our coalition.
And I will tell members that letter is going to be sent to you, and it is well written, and I would encourage you all to read it. All right, let's see. I see no other hands. So why don't we feel free, if something occurs to you and you're a member, to raise your hand, but I do want to mention that we are figuring out ways in which we can receive input from members of the public, and hopefully we are going to have a dedicated email through SPAC for people to submit letters or memos or whatever is comfortable for them to share their viewpoint, or if they want to alert us to something that they feel should be considered by the task force members, we're happy to do that. So now I would like to take up the question of continuing to meet or delaying meetings until we have a full contingent of appointments. I'll review. We are missing the 3 retired judges that are appointed by the governor. It is in process, but I don't have a clear idea, although I'm going to reach out to my contacts in the LG's office who are facilitating it on timing. And the other member that we're missing is a representative of a victims organization. So I will put it out there. If any of you have someone you would like to suggest, please email me and we will look at whoever you suggest and interview them, see if they're interested, and hopefully have somebody appointed in that slot relatively quickly. So I will open the floor to how we feel about meeting. And Scott, since you brought this subject up earlier, I will let you share your point of view one more time.
I'll yield to Representative Cassidy, had her hand up, and I welcome where her thinking is.
I think that for this process to be to have integrity, I think that we should, in particular, ensure that those voices are present. I think that moving forward without those perspectives, it would, frankly, weaken the quality of our work product. So I would move that we delay until we are a full family.
Do we have any other thoughts or comments?
I wonder if there's a glass half full here, which is to hang on to the dates that we've identified and hold those dates. And as we get closer to the March date, if it turns out that we don't have those constituencies represented, then push back. I have
feelings about the mechanism for it. I don't necessarily care about the logistics. I care about us being full.
Well, me too, but I also know that it can be a challenge to schedule people.
Yeah.
LaToya, did you have something you want to add?
I would agree with Representative Cassidy. I think, getting too far down the road in the conversations without those voices may lead us to a path where we have to kind of backtrack and cover some of the issues or concerns or conversations that we've already had. And in order for us to push out a robust recommendation that takes into consideration all viewpoints, we really need to have those voices at the table, being a part of these discussions.
All right, I'll ask if there's anyone who has a contrary viewpoint that they would like to share. Okay. Well, then I think what I'm hearing is we keep the March date. So everybody pencil it in. It's March 18th.
And Kathy, if I just, sorry to interrupt, but if Senator Peters and I, as the sponsors, can be helpful to you in pressing for those appointments, I feel comfortable in speaking for him on this, that we would be happy to help.
Thank you. I always like to have legislative champions.
And that's not leaving out Darren and Ryan. If they want to weigh in too, that's I welcome them.
Absolutely.
Yep, I'll echo that on Senator Bailey's behalf. We're happy to do what we can to make sure these get appointed in a timely fashion.
Great. Thank you all. Well, we'll strategize a little bit about that offline. So we will pencil in March 18th and May 20th. I'm sorry, April 29th and May 20th, pending full appointments to, pending the missing appointments being included. So I guess we should probably have a motion to adopt that formally.
So moved.
Okay, second?
Seconded.
All righty. We will do a roll call. Kelly Cassidy,
Yes.
Ryan Spain, I think he may have jumped off. Robert Peters,
Yes.
Colin Mosley for Darren Bailey,
Bailey votes aye.
Bob Berlin,
Yes.
Ari Jones,
Yes.
Scott Main,
Yes.
Sharon Mitchell,
Yes.
Latoya Hughes,
Yes.
Joby Cates,
Yes.
Yakov Delaney,
Yes.
thanks Yakov, Mitchell Davis,
Yes.
and Shobha Mahadev.
Yes.
Okay, well, it is unanimous. So I think I will hand it back to Susan and Lisa to summarize and give us a little next steps. I think you already touched on next steps, but go ahead.
I butt in for a quick session with a procedural question.
Sure.
So, and this is to the four elected legislators, members of the Illinois General Assembly. I know we have an abbreviated session in front of us. And is there any need to change the final due date of the report just in case? Because if we don't, for example, let's say we don't get anyone until the April or May meeting, then we've already probably missed the boat to tack time on to July. Is there any value in doing that legislatively while we have the chance, or is it not important? I don't know.
I'm open to it, and I don't think it would be that hard to do if we needed to do it. We'd toss an amendment at the last minute if we found ourselves not able to move forward.
Great, thanks.
Lisa.
Okay, so I tried to think of how I could summarize the discussion. It's been very rich. I'll give it a shot. We covered a lot of things. So here's some highlights that I heard. First of all, that this is an incredibly complex issue with kind of no clear answer when it comes to how we're gonna create recommendations to reduce the prison population. Fundamentally, ideally, we'd address the root causes of crime, and the relationship between the person committing a crime and the victim of a crime is not many times there's a fine line. That the prison system is both undertaxed and under-resourced, that the data collection in the prison system leaves something to be desired in terms of how we track factors that should weigh into consideration for a different sentence. That there's a number of factors that we could weigh when making those assumptions. But again, I think we'd have to change the way we track data. We also, for the next meeting, would need additional data for eligibility, and the team would put that together. And I welcome kind of other big things that I've missed in my summary. Kind of what did people hear?
I'll add one, which is that it's a tricky piece of business to find the right point of entry because we want to think about the larger system and early release and second looks, but don't have the data or the procedure to go to the granular level. So we're really looking at what are the big picture changes that could be made or recommendations that could be made for making a big difference in reducing the prison population and accommodating the characteristics that were outlined in the chat.
Latoya, I see a hand raised.
Yes, I would agree with Susan. One of the things that I heard is that when we talk about data collection, the data collection points pre the individual coming to the Illinois Department of Corrections has some challenges for some of the information that people feel is really important to collect. And so not just specifically within IDOC, what it is that we collect, but what's collected before someone is even sentenced to IDOC, I think is where some of the information lies that people really want to know for this conversation.
So we can certainly put together a probably one-page look at data gaps. And that will tell us what we have and what we don't have. And as Mark said in his presentation, if you have a data question, send it to us. And, SPAC's methodology is really pretty simple. Do we have sufficient data and is it sufficiently reliable to yield a credible result? And if the answer is yes, we'll take a shot. If the answer is no, we'll do the best we can with what we have. But I think we can probably get to some, broad stroke responses to a lot of the things that we heard today. And certainly one thing we can do is kind of like a side by side, what we knew at the time some of these policies were put in place and what we know now, which is the subject of a lot of different areas of research. So, that's what's kind of two approaches that we can take. And I will just also caution that when I say what we know now, SPAC reads research with a critical eye, and we look first. Well, I don't look first, but this team looks first at methodology. And if the methodology is skewed or weak, then we will not reference it or rely on it. So, there are a few areas where literally there is no two sides. It's just pretty well established. And we can certainly put together an overview of those broad points, and kind of show the gaps of where we don't have the information we need and tell you what we can suss out from criminal history and DOC.
And I guess with that, Kathy, I would like to close by saying it's been an amazingly thoughtful and rich discussion today. I am struck by the complexity of this, but I'm also noticing how seriously everyone is taking this set of questions, and the knowledge base that's being brought together to tackle this set of issues is really pretty remarkable. I think we made tremendous progress today, and I'm really looking forward to the next meeting. Hopefully it will be in March, but we will certainly circle back on that. Final comments, Kathy?
I just want to thank everybody and alert you, you might get some homework assignments from us or requests for help. And like I said, if you have thoughts or questions or, suggestions for what we need to look at, send them along. And for those of you who are members of the public, please keep an eye on our website, as we will post when we have that mailbox open and ready, and meeting information will be on that website as well. So thank you to the members of the public who have joined us today. We appreciate it. And with that, I will say goodbye to all of you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.